What if the God worshipped by billions today was once nothing more than a desert spirit? And what if I told you that he was not in the heavens, but among the sands, a God of storms, a spirit of wrath that followed nomadic tribes through wind and war, not almighty, not eternal, but simply one among many, in a realm where El sat on the throne, where Bizol commanded thunder, where Asherah spread her wings over the land. Yahweh was no king, but perhaps only a servant. Today, we embark on a dangerous journey behind the curtains of the Bible, into a time when Yahweh was not yet the only one, when he lived side by side with Enlil, Asherah, Bezalel and El. Asherah, Bezalel and El. Is he truly the creator of all, or just one among many who managed to rise to the top of the divine pantheon? We will open texts that have been hidden from believers for centuries, trace the transformation of Yahweh from tribal spirit to God of gods, and we will try to answer the most important question of all: who was he really? But before we dive into this story, welcome to the Dark Storyteller. Leave a like, subscribe, and write in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Allow yourself to relax and sink into the mysterious world of esoteric knowledge. Most religious traditions describe Yahweh as eternal, singular, and unchanging. But why do we even begin to question this image? What has led historians, archaeologists, and linguists to dig deeper, disturbing the silence of millennia? The answer lies in discoveries that don't fit the official narrative. Clay tablets, carved limestone stelae, remnants of ancient shrines, all of them tell a story the church would rather forget, because long before Yahweh became the center of monotheism, he was just one among many gods worshipped across Canaan. In ancient Ugarit, where the richest pantheon of West Semitic gods was preserved, his name doesn't appear at all, at least not in a central role. There El reigned, the wise elder god of the sky, who presided over assemblies of other deities. Bezalel, the god of thunder and rain, was the hero of many myths about his battles with the god of death. Mot, Asherah, the mother of gods, was associated with fertility, water, and sacred trees. In this context, Yahweh, if he existed at all, was a local deity, a spirit of a particular tribe, perhaps associated with storm, war, or desert. But everything changed when the tribes of Israel, migrating from the deserts into Canaan, began to absorb cultural elements of the native populations. Archaeological research at Timnah, where a temple to the goddess Asherah was discovered, suggests the possible coexistence of her cult with the early worship of Yahweh. This is confirmed by inscriptions from Kuntilet Adrud, an ancient site in the southern Sinai. There a jar fragment was found bearing the words, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." These words suggest that in popular religion, Yahweh had a consort, a goddess, likely an adaptation of Asherah. She was not an enemy, not demonized. She was beside him. She means this was not a solitary god, but a divine pair. Then that raises questions that shatter official theology. In the oldest layers of the Bible, if you look closely, Yahweh does not appear as a transcendent spirit. He walks, speaks aloud, gets angry, punishes, and fights. In the book of Genesis, he strolls through the garden. In Exodus, he descends on Mount Sinai, in fire and smoke, as if on a theatrical stage. This image is closer to Sumerian or Canaanite gods, anthropomorphic, emotional, and present. Now consider Deuteronomy 32:8-9, preserved in its original form in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It says that the Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, and that Yahweh received Israel as his portion. This reads as if Yahweh was one among many, in a divine allocation of peoples. In later versions, The text was edited to say Sons of Israel instead of Sons of God. That editorial change is not just grammatical, it's a rewriting of history. If we go even deeper, we find that Yahweh's name may be tied to the regions of Edom or Midian. Ancient texts, such as the Song of Deborah in the Book of Judges, mention Yahweh coming from Seir, from the mountains of Edom. It's the desert region of southern Jordan, inhabited by nomadic tribes. It was likely there that he originated as a god of storm and war, and it made sense. In a hostile climate, full of conflict, nomadic tribes needed a god of fire, strength, and lightning. They envisioned him as one who commands thunder, enforces justice, and burns enemies. That fiery image eventually became the pillar of fire that led Israel through the wilderness. But from that desert origin, he entered Canaan, where he encountered the resident gods, Lbaaeee. Israel was never an isolated religious community. It constantly interacted with surrounding peoples, Phoenicians, Moabites, Ammonites, Egyptians. These peoples had their own pantheons, often strikingly similar. In that polytheistic environment, Yahweh's image began to evolve. There was a deliberate religious shift. Priests and prophets rewrote texts, removed the names of other gods, and strengthened Yahweh's cult. Gradually, he transformed from one among many into the only true one. But remnants of that past can still be found in inconsistencies, contradictory imagery, and forbidden texts. For instance, in one of the Psalms, God is called Elohim, a plural form meaning gods. In Genesis we read, "Let us make man in our image," a phrase that preserves traces of polytheistic origins. This is not a linear story of faith, but an entanglement of myths, wars, politics, and cultural exchanges that shaped what we now consider eternal. Yahweh didn't emerge in a vacuum. He was part of a pantheon, and only after centuries of trauma and exile, when Israel lost its land and freedom, a new idea was born, a single God who rules everything. This was a response to catastrophe. It was a way to find meaning in suffering. But that transformation demanded sacrifice. The other gods had to be erased, destroyed, condemned. That's when Asherah became an idol, Baal, the enemy. El vanished, and Yahweh remained, alone, powerful, singular. But if we can rewind that process, layer by layer, we may see who he truly was, and how easily belief becomes revision. Yahweh was not always the Most High. Perhaps he was once just a whisper in the desert wind, a name among many, a flame among the dunes. And only time, power, and rewriting made him what he is today. This is only the beginning of our journey, because to understand who Yahweh became, we must uncover who he once was, and we must be ready for answers that change everything. Before Yahweh became the God of heaven and earth, before his name thundered from mountaintops and echoed through sanctuaries of stone and silence, he existed not in dominance, but in obscurity. To understand how a desert deity once worshipped by scattered nomads came to stand above all others, one must first descend into the world from which he emerged, a world already saturated with gods, rituals, myths, and mysteries. The ancient Near East was no spiritual void awaiting revelation. It was a living, breathing web of faith, where every city, every mountain, every river bore the mark of a divine presence. Here, the gods were everywhere, in the stars, in the harvest, in dreams and in blood. And in this crowded divine theater, Yahweh's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling on the edge of a storm no one yet noticed. In Mesopotamia, the cities reached toward the skies with temples shaped like stairways to the heavens, ziggurats that connected earth to the divine, Anu, the distant sky god, Enlil, the fierce wind lord, Enki, master of fresh water and magic, Inanna, the goddess of both desire and war. These were not metaphors. These were real powers, written into the fabric of life itself. They had personalities, histories, rivalries. Their stories were sung by priestesses in shadowy chambers, carved onto tablets that outlived empires. Marduk, who began as a minor deity, rose through a cosmic war against the goddess Tiamat to become the chief of the Babylonian pantheon. He didn't always reign, he fought his way into power, and his ascent echoes the rise of another god, who would one day also claim the throne through fire and narrative. Further west, the Nile cradled a pantheon as ancient as the pyramids. In Egypt, gods were not just creators, they were cosmic principles, manifest in form and function. Ra lit the world by day, and sailed the underworld by night. Osiris ruled the realm of the dead, while his son Horus watched over the pharaohs. Thoth measured time and wrote divine law. Isis held together the pieces of broken gods and broken worlds. Here, religion was not a belief system, it was the operating system of reality. Every ritual was a reenactment of cosmic balance. Every image carved into stone was a prayer, a contract, a spell. The gods here did not need belief, they required order, mat, and they enforced it with terrifying precision. Canaan, nestled between these great civilizations, was no less sacred. Its hills and valleys pulsed with the presence of ancient divinities. Eld, the high god, was a patriarchal figure, distant, wise, and eternal. He sat on his throne among the stars, ruling over a divine council. Baal, the storm god, brought rain to the fields and thunder to the battlefield. His victories over Yam, the sea, and Mot, the death, were more than myth. They were agricultural cycles turned into poetry. Asherah, the queen of heaven, nurtured life and guided fate. She was both mother and mystery, sometimes consort of El, sometimes of Yahweh himself. Astarte danced at the edges of war and seduction. The pantheon was vibrant, shifting, and deeply embedded in daily life. Every tree, every stone, every breath had a name and a watcher. It is within this saturated world of faith that Yahweh first stirs, and at first his presence is small. There is no temple to him in Uruk, no priesthood in Memphis, no hymns in Ugarit that carry his name. He does not yet walk among the gods. Instead, he arrives from the south, from the lands of Eldam, Seir, and Midian. Ancient songs preserved in the Hebrew Bible describe Yahweh as coming from the desert, wrapped in fire and storm. Judges 5:4 speaks of his coming from Seir, from Edom's mountains. Habakkuk 3 echoes the same geography. These are not metaphors, these are coordinates. Yahweh was a god of the wilderness, a god of sandstorms and vengeance, born not in palaces but in dust. He may have begun as a storm god, the kind feared and respected by nomads who crossed the dry, deadly lands between kingdoms. The imagery that clings to him in early texts supports this: smoke, fire, thunder, a voice like many waters, earthquakes in his wake. He rides the clouds, splits the heavens, shatters mountains. These are not the traits of a philosophical deity, they are the weapons of a warrior god, one who must conquer not only human hearts, but the thrones of other gods. And indeed, in the earliest scriptures, he is not yet alone. He commands loyalty, but he does not yet claim exclusivity. You shall have no other gods before me, does not deny their existence, it demands preference. Archaeological discoveries deepen this story. At Kuntilet, Edrud, a site in the northern Sinai, dating to the 8th century BCE, inscriptions were found that read, "Blessed be you by Yahweh of Samaria, and his Asherah." His Asherah. The phrase suggests partnership, not opposition. It implies that in the minds of some ancient Israelites, Yahweh had a consort, a female counterpart, echoing the sacred couples of neighboring pantheons. These inscriptions were not marginal or secret, they were part of the public religious life of the time. The line between Yahweh and the older gods was not yet firm. It was porous, fluid, changing with each generation. In the Ugaritic texts, gods sit together in council, their debates shaping the world. This same structure is preserved, barely veiled, In Psalm 82, where God stands in the divine assembly, he judges among the gods, plural, Elohim. And in the book of Job, the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh, among them a being called the Satan, not yet the devil, but a wandering accuser, a member of the court. These fragments are not errors, they are fossils, evidence of an earlier stratum of belief, before monotheism hardened into dogma. Even Yahweh's name may hold clues to his origin. Some scholars trace it to a root meaning to be, aligning with the mysterious statement in Exodus, "I am that I am." But others suggest connections to southern tribal deities, known in Egyptian texts as Shasu of Yob, a nomadic group, worshipping a god with a name eerily close to Yahweh's. These inscriptions date to the 14th century BCE, carved long before Moses saw fire in a bush. The Egyptian records speak of Yob, in the land of Edom, placing the god exactly where the oldest biblical poems say he came from, not from heaven, from the wilderness. The transformation of Yahweh, from a marginal storm god to the supreme being of monotheism, was not instant. It was a slow, complex negotiation between competing beliefs, shifting identities, and historical trauma. The exile to Babylon shattered the old temple-based religion. In its place, something new took shape, a god no longer tied to land or image, who dwelled not in a shrine, but in the text itself. This abstraction was revolutionary. It was survival reimagined as purity. But beneath the polished theology, the roots still twist in older soil. Across Israelite sites, altars have been uncovered that do not match the prescriptions of Leviticus. Pillars, standing stones, multiple shrines. These are echoes of a time before centralization. At Arad, a temple was discovered with 2 incense altars and 2 standing stones, perhaps representing Yahweh and his Asherah. The worship was tangible, domestic, shared. It was only later, under Josiah's reforms and the exile's aftermath, that the faith was reshaped into something more exclusive, more linear. The editors of Deuteronomy and the priestly source carved out a new narrative: one God, one law, one people. But beneath the edits, the older story still lingers like ghost writing under scraped parchment. Yahweh's rise was not the emergence of truth in a void. It was the ascension of one voice among many, a God who outlasted his rivals, not because he was alone, but because his followers made him alone. The process was political, theological, poetic, and violent. It involved purges, rewritings, burnings, and proclamations, and yet, traces remain. In language, in liturgy, in forgotten names, and forbidden symbols. The mosaic may have been shattered, but the pieces never disappeared. Each time a prophet denounces Baal, each time Asherah is cursed, each time Yahweh thunders that he alone is God, it is a reminder that others once stood beside him, and that memory, suppressed but never fully erased, is the shadow that follows him still. He was not always the maker of heaven and earth. Before the cosmos bowed to his name, before angels sang his praises, and prophets trembled at his voice, Yahweh was something far smaller, more primal, and more dangerous. He was not the beginning of all things. He was born within things already begun, a God, not of Genesis, but of the wilderness, a God of dust and fire, a God of one tribe. He walked not above the world, but beside it, shrouded in storm clouds, wielding lightning like a blade, called upon not by all people, but by a few, wanderers, warriors, outcasts, those who moved between borders and believed their God moved with them. Long before he was seated upon a throne of eternity, Yahweh's kingdom was the cracked earth and burning skies of the desert. The first clear signs of his existence lie not in Israelite temples, but in Egyptian records, in inscriptions dating back to the 14th century BCE. Egyptian scribes speak of the Shasu of Yahweh, a nomadic group living in the harsh, dry lands south of Canaan. Their deity was not given a title of Lord of all, nor Creator of the universe. He was simply Yahweh, a name, a tribal god. The Shasu were not kings or city dwellers. They were wanderers, herders, raiders, survivors of the edges, and their god was shaped by the landscape they moved through, volatile, untamed, merciless. This Yahweh, who would later be known as Yahweh, was not yet clothed in theology. He was raw and immediate, a divine force felt in the howl of the wind and the flash of fire across the mountains. In the oldest layers of biblical poetry, this elemental character still survives. In the Song of Deborah, one of the most ancient passages in the book of Judges, Yahweh is described as coming from Seir, from the mountains of Edom, southern territories, beyond Israelite lands. The earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water, the mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai. These are not abstract images, they are the language of a storm deity, a god of weather and war. His arrival is not gentle, it is violent, a convulsion of nature. In Habakkuk 3, another early poem preserved within the canon, the prophet speaks of God coming from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Again, in Edomite terrain, his splendor covers the heavens, his brightness, like the sun, plague and fire in his wake. These verses do not describe a creator speaking worlds into being. They speak of a destroyer moving across a battlefield. This God was not yet the deity of all nations. He belonged to a people, and not even all of them. When Moses encounters him in the wilderness, Yahweh does not introduce himself as the one true God of everything. He says, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." It is a lineage, not a universal claim. He is the God of a family, a tribe, a promise made beneath the stars of an empty desert. And when he demands Moses return to Egypt, it is not to save the world, it is to retrieve my people, not all people. The possessiveness is clear, sharp, ancient. And what does this God look like when he appears? Not light, not love, but fire, a bush that burns without being consumed, a mountain that smokes and shakes, thunder and trumpet blasts, and voices like earthquakes. He speaks in riddles, he demands obedience, he threatens, he kills. This is not the gentle shepherd of later psalms. This is the storm god in his rawest form. 1 foot still in the pantheon of older powers. Storm gods were common throughout the region. Baal-Hadad in Canaan, Adad in Mesopotamia, Set in Egypt. These deities wielded thunder, controlled rain, and fought monsters of chaos. Their power sustained agriculture, but also brought destruction. Yahweh fits this mold, not by accident, but by inheritance. Like Yahweh, he rides the clouds. Like Adad, he sends thunder as judgment. Like Set, he is invoked in battle. His earliest followers, according to scholars, may have seen him not as an exception to the storm gods of the region, but as their superior rival. In a polytheistic world, supremacy did not mean exclusivity, it meant dominance. A god could rise among gods, just as a king could rise among kings. In Exodus, Yahweh is described as a man of war. His presence in battle is not symbolic. He drowns Pharaoh's army, breaks the chariots, brings plagues, commands the death of firstborns. He does not instruct from afar. He invades, he conquers, he kills, and his laws, when finally given, are not universal moral truths. They are a covenant, a contract between him and his people. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. not because they are better, because they are chosen. He chooses them, and they must choose him, exclusively, jealously. The first commandment is clear: you shall have no other gods before me, not because they don't exist, but because they are rivals. Even the ark, the sacred box carried through the wilderness, is a war object. It leads the people into battle. It is not a symbol of peace. It is a throne of a mobile God who moves with his army. Yahweh is no temple-bound figure. He travels, he camps, he descends in fire and cloud. He speaks in storms. The motif of storm and warfare follows him relentlessly through the early texts. When the Israelites enter Canaan, the God who goes before them is not a philosopher or a judge. He is a warrior king. He commands genocide. He demands the destruction of idols, temples, sacred trees. His hatred of other gods is not theological, it is territorial. He wants their places burned, their names erased, their worshippers slaughtered. In Deuteronomy, he says, tear down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. This is the language of conquest, religious, political, military. The God who once shared space with others has begun to consume it. But in the shadows, the old world lingers. Not all tribes obey. Some continue to honor the mother goddess in secret. Some whisper prayers to Yahweh in the hills. The prophets rage against this, not because it's strange, but because it's familiar. They know these gods. They are family gods, Canaanite gods, cousins. The lines are not clean. They are bleeding, broken, rewritten, and Yahweh, to rise above them, must become something new. The transformation is slow and deliberate. Over centuries, he absorbs attributes from other gods. From El, he takes the role of creator and judge. From Yahweh, he keeps the storm and the cloud. From Asherah, perhaps, the traces of divine presence that once softened his image. And from exile, he gains what none of the others could offer: universality. A God who no longer needs a land, a throne, a temple. A God who lives in law, in memory, in language. But in the beginning, he was not that. He was fire, and war, and storm. Modern scholars see in Yahweh's earliest worship a pattern known across ancient religion: a small local God, elevated through conquest, narrative, and trauma. His uniqueness was not in his birth, but in his transformation. The people who followed him needed a God who could march with them, fight for them, speak from mountains, and later, they would need a God who could survive without sanctuary, a God who could live in exile. Yahweh became both, but he did not begin that way. The gods of the storm are never silent. Their voices rumble beneath the surface, hidden in the texts that were edited, but never fully erased. Yahweh's journey, from tribal war god to universal father, is not a story of divine evolution. It is a story of memory, blood and fire, of people carving meaning into survival. And in that story, the storm still speaks. Long before monotheism burned away the names of rival gods, long before Yahweh stood alone in the heavens, the spiritual landscape of Canaan was a living, breathing pantheon, a divine court where voices competed for worship, and the cosmos was ruled by gods who bled, loved, and fought like kings. Yahweh was not the first to walk across these sacred hills. He was a new presence in an ancient realm, where the sky was already spoken for, the rains already had a master, and the earth already bore the mark of a mother. To truly understand how Yahweh rose, we must first understand who stood beside him, and who, in time, he would absorb, replace, or erase. The god El was not simply a character in old poems. He was the father of gods, the High One, El Elyon, the most ancient of all the Canaanite deities. In Ugaritic texts, his image is that of an elder, bearded, robed, seated on a throne beneath the stars. He is not warlike or thunderous. He is contemplative, slow to speak, and wise. His domain is vast but passive. He governs by decree, not by sword. He is the architect of fate, the patriarch of the divine family. His children call him Father. His wife, Asherah, calls him Beloved. Together they rule from the divine mountain, which is not metaphor but mythic geography, a place between heaven and earth, a sanctuary of clouds, where decisions echo into the world of mortals. El was not a metaphor for justice or abstraction. He was a real and immediate force in the minds of those who carved his name into altars and sang his praises beneath sacred trees. The Bible remembers him, though it tries to forget. In the earliest traditions, Yahweh is not the Most High. El is. Deuteronomy 32, in its original form preserved by the Dead Sea Scrolls, says, "When the Most High El Elyon gave the nations their inheritance, he set boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. Yahweh's portion was his people." Yahweh does not assign the nations. He receives one. He is not the Most High. He is one of the divine sons. This is not a later invention. It is a glimpse into the scaffolding beneath Scripture, a time when the divine realm was crowded, hierarchical, and shockingly human. And then there was Bolder, the storm god, the rider on the clouds, the bringer of rain, and the breaker of drought. His name means Lord, and for centuries, he was exactly that. Worshipped across the Levant, Bol was a central figure in the Canaanite pantheon. Energetic, passionate, heroic, he battled Yam, the sea god, in a war of chaos and control. He descended into the underworld to face Mot, the god of death, and rose again in spring, bringing fertility back to the land. His temples stood high on hills, his altars smoked with offerings, his statues were adorned with golden horns and weapons of lightning. Bol was not abstract. He was invoked in times of famine, called upon in times of war. His rituals were ecstatic, dramatic, and sometimes bloody. He was the storm personified, the crack of thunder with a name, and in many ways, his traits would later be worn like a stolen crown by Yahweh himself. The Hebrew Bible often positions Bol as the enemy, a false god, a corrupter of Israel. But in the earliest texts, the similarities between Bol and Yahweh are too sharp to ignore. Bol rides the clouds, so does Yahweh. Bol's voice is thunder, Yahweh's too. Bol defeats chaos, brings order, sustains the seasons, exactly the same role Yahweh takes in Job and the Psalms. Some scholars suggest that Yahweh may have even absorbed Bol's titles, stripped them of their name, and claimed them as his own. There are places in Scripture where the term Bol is used to refer to Yahweh. It was only later, under theological pressure, that the word became taboo, like a rival king, whose image had to be erased from the murals. But no figure reveals the lost depths of early Israelite religion more than Asherah, the mother goddess, the queen of heaven, the silent figure behind the veil of Scripture. She appears in Ugaritic texts as the consort of El, the bearer of 70 divine sons, the embodiment of fertility, protection, and divine wisdom. She is often linked with sacred trees, groves, and the sea. In her symbols, serpents, lions, pillars, she radiates an ancient femininity too wild for later scribes to tame. And yet, she is not absent from early Israelite worship. At Kontileta Jude, inscriptions invoke Yahweh and his Asherah, not in opposition, in union, a divine pair, a god and his goddess. In these moments, we glimpse a world not yet cleansed of the sacred feminine, a world where the people of Yahweh saw no contradiction in honoring him alongside a powerful mother deity. In many ancient religions, gods did not exist in isolation. They were part of relationships, families, councils, hierarchies. El and Asherah, Bol and Anat. These pairings reflected not only theology, but the human structure of life, male and female, creator and nurturer, storm and soil. Yahweh's eventual solitude was not theological inevitability. It was political and editorial. Over time, Asherah was removed, first from temples, then from memory. Her sacred poles were cut down, her name became an abomination, and yet, in the underlayers of the text, she still lingers. The feminine presence of divine wisdom, called Hokmah, in Proverbs, described as being beside God at the creation of the world, bears her shadow. Some see in the Shekinah, the indwelling presence of God, the echo of the goddess no longer named. The war Yahweh waged was not only against human enemies, it was against other gods, and not just any gods, but ones whose bloodlines were once intertwined with his own. In the book of Exodus, he declares, "I am a jealous God." Jealousy implies competition. His rage against Boleh, his denial of Asherah, his elevation above El, all point to a divine civil war, fought not with swords, but with stories. The Book of Kings describes how Queen Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, introduced the worship of Baal and Asherah into the Israelite court. The prophet Elijah confronts her priests, calls down fire, and slaughters them. This is not only about idolatry, it is about erasing the divine past, about declaring which God will remain, and which must be destroyed in fire and blood. But archaeology betrays the narrative. The domestic shrines, household idols, and inscribed blessings show that many Israelites continued to worship Yahweh alongside these older gods. They prayed to him, yes, but also honored Asherah. They did not see conflict. Their spirituality was plural, layered, alive. It was only through centuries of prophetic denunciation, exile, and priestly reform that the older gods were pushed into darkness, and even then, their bones still lie beneath the foundation stones. Psalm 82, a rarely understood passage, opens with a chilling image. God stands in the divine council. He renders judgment among the gods. It does not say false gods. It says gods, real, present. Yahweh stands among them and declares their time is over. I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals. It is the divine coup rendered in poetry, the last stand of the old pantheon, a moment frozen in the text, where the victor rewrites the order of heaven itself. In later traditions, angels replace the gods. The divine council becomes a heavenly court. The names change, but the architecture remains. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, they fill the empty seats once occupied by Boleh, Anat, and others. The war ends not with annihilation, but with assimilation. The rivals are transformed, demoted, absorbed. Their myths re-emerge in new forms, retold, disguised, sanctified. But even now, the ancient names still speak. In the stones of Ugarit, in the jars of Kuntalet-Ajurid, in the shadows of Deuteronomy. El, the silent father, Baal, the cloud rider, Asherah, the mother of life. Their presence remains, not as threats, but as reminders. Yahweh did not rise in a vacuum. He rose from within a crowd, and before he ruled the heavens alone, he stood among gods. Stone does not lie. It does not exaggerate, nor repent. It endures, and long before parchments were copied by candlelight, before redactors chose which verses to preserve and which gods to exile into silence, a king took chisel to basalt and told his story, in blood, in pride, and in war. The year was around 840 BCE. The place, the kingdom of Moab. The king's name, Mesha. His people had long been under Israelite control, but in a moment of rebellion, Mesha broke free, and in doing so carved into stone a window into a world where Yahweh was not yet the ruler of heaven and earth, but simply another god among many, a god of one people, a god of war. The Mesha stele, also known as the Moabite stone, is a tall black slab of volcanic rock, unearthed in the 19th century in Deban, Jordan, written in elegant Moabite script. It boasts of conquest, revenge, and divine favor. I am Mesha, son of Chemoshite, king of Moab. My father ruled over Moab 30 years, and I reigned after my father. He speaks not of universal justice or eternal truths, but of territories and gods, of battles fought and altars built. The world it reveals is not monotheistic, it is theocratic and crowded. Mesha attributes his success to his god, Chemosh, the national deity of Moab. He does not thank a distant cosmic power, but a specific localized divine warrior. Chemosh was not symbolic. He marched with armies, chose kings, and demanded loyalty. And when Moab fell under the hand of Israel, it was interpreted as Chemosh's anger. But now, with rebellion successful, Mesha declares that Chemosh has returned. Chemosh said to me, "Go, take Nebo from Israel." And he did, and in the process, he captured thousands, slaughtered them, and dedicated the spoils and the people to Chemosh. But buried within this testimony is a line that burns through history. I took from it the vessels of Yahweh and dragged them before Chemosh. Yahweh, not as the name of a distant, all-powerful creator, but as a national God of Israel, a rival, a tribal force, defeated in battle, his artifacts seized, his worship humiliated. The sentence is short, almost careless, but in its brevity lies revelation, for this is the first known mention of Yahweh outside the pages of the Bible, not on sacred scrolls, but in the boasts of an enemy king. This Yahweh is not yet the omnipotent deity who commands the stars. He is not the invisible architect of time. He is a God bound to a people, a place, and a shrine. His power, in this account, was not infinite. It was territorial, and it could be challenged. It could lose. It did lose. The Moabites took his sacred city, raided his temple, and dragged his holy objects in chains before another god, not in metaphor, in ritual, in reality. In this moment, the gods were not theoretical, they were military allies. Victory was a sign of divine favor, defeat a sign of abandonment. The gods did not rule from distant heavens. They marched with armies, possessed kings, and made their will known through blood and fire. The Mesha Stele makes no attempt to deny Yahweh's existence. Instead, it confirms him, but as a rival, a regional god, one voice in a loud and dangerous divine chorus. This picture aligns with what archaeology and textual analysis have begun to recover, that the ancient Near East was not defined by atheism or belief, but by allegiance. People did not ask whether gods existed, they asked which god they belonged to, which altar they should serve, which name would bring rain or victory, or vengeance. The Moabites served Chemosh, the Ammonites worshipped Milcom, the Philistines had Dagon, the Canaanites bowed to Baal, and the Israelites, they had Yahweh. But it is the act of capturing his vessels that exposes something deeper. The objects of Yahweh's worship were physical, transportable, desecratable. They could be taken, profaned, paraded. This was not a religion of abstract lore. It was tangible, embodied. The gods lived in their items, their places, their symbols, and to drag Yahweh's holy vessels before Chemosh was not just an insult. It was an act of spiritual warfare, a cosmic defeat. The Bible itself reflects a world where such reversals were real. The Ark of the Covenant, that sacred container of Yahweh's presence, is captured in 1 Samuel by the Philistines. Placed in the temple of Dagon, it causes havoc, but its capture is never denied. The God of Israel could be robbed, his presence could be moved, his favor could be lost, and it is precisely this vulnerability that made him relatable, even dangerous. The people did not worship a God immune to suffering, they worshipped a God who entered into it, who fought and raged and demanded, and who, when ignored, turned his face and let his people fall. The Mesha Stele is not just a Moabite relic. It is a mirror held up to early Israelite religion. It shows us how others saw Yahweh, not as a fiction, not as a devil, but as a God, one God, among others, strong, feared, but not untouchable. The Bible speaks of Moab as wicked, as rebellious, but here we see their own words, their own pride, their own theology, centered not on denying Israel's God, but defeating him. There is no universalism here, no claim that all gods are false, only that theirs is stronger. This is the world before doctrine, before the creeds, a world where theology was politics, and war was the measure of divinity. The gods were as real as the kings who served them, and just as vulnerable, and even in defeat, Yahweh remained. His name endured, his worship continued, but he had not yet become the only. He was still one among many, with his own land, his own people, his own wars. The shift to monotheism had not yet arrived. It would take centuries of exile, redaction, and silence to recast Yahweh, not as a god of war, but as the God of all. The Mesha Stele does not fit the official narrative. That is why it was forgotten, buried, shattered. But stone remembers. Its letters are not parables, they are declarations, and in their lines we see the old world full of gods, full of blood, full of faith. There is no moral lesson here, no theological victory, only a voice from the dust, speaking across 3,000 years, reminding us that Yahweh's story did not begin with creation, it began with conquest, and in those earliest wars, he did not always win. Before the first psalm was sung, before the laws were carved in stone, before prophets roamed the hills crying out in Yahweh's name, there was a people the empires barely noticed, wanderers with no city, no temple, no throne. They moved with the dust, following goats and stars, speaking languages that changed with the wind, kneeling to a God who had no carved image, no golden eye, no sculpted form. They were not builders, they were survivors, and long before the scribes of Israel gave Yahweh his narrative crown, the Egyptians, lords of papyrus and empire, recorded something they themselves did not understand: a name, a place, a god, 4 consonants scratched into the vast machinery of a civilization that never worshipped him. You, the god of a people called the Shasu. The Shasu were not a kingdom, they were a whisper in the desert, a word said with suspicion by pharaohs and generals. In Egyptian inscriptions from the New Kingdom period, dating to the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, the Shasu appear in military records, listed among the threats to Egypt's eastern frontier. They were described as brigands, as nomads, as those who came out of the desert and disrupted trade routes, harassed border outposts, vanished into the mountains. But in one inscription, found at the great temple of Amun in Karnak, and dated to the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, the list of foreign lands contains an anomaly: the land of the Shasu of U, not a city, not a nation, a tribal group, associated with a god, and that god's name is chillingly familiar. U, no vowels, no context, just a fragment, but in those 3 letters, written in the language of the pharaohs, lies one of the oldest references to Yahweh ever recorded, older than Moses, older than Sinai, older than the written Torah. And it is not Israel that is named, it is not Judah, it is not Jerusalem, it is the Shasu, a people lost to time, but tethered to a name that would one day command empires. Scholars have long debated the nature of the Shasu. Some suggest they were precursors to the Israelites, a population from which the later tribes emerged. Others argue they were simply one of many nomadic groups, sharing culture and gods with the early Hebrews. What is certain is that they were real, and their association with you is not metaphorical. It appears multiple times, in multiple records. The Egyptians were not attempting theology, they were listing enemies, and among them, the Shasu of Yahweh. This Yahweh is not yet the God of Abraham. He has no scripture, no priesthood, no commandments. He is a tribal deity, regional, mysterious, powerful in ways only the desert can shape. He does not sit on a throne of light. He rides with the wind, hidden behind storms. His people have no temple, because their God does not dwell in walls. He travels with them, lives in the earth, the rocks, the silence. To Egyptian eyes, this God had no face, no image, no shrine to defile, just a name, a dangerous one, echoing from the desert, where empires lose their soldiers and their certainty. The geography matches the biblical echoes. The land of the Shasu of Yu was situated in the regions of Edom and Seir, exactly where the Hebrew Bible later says Yahweh came from. Judges 5 sings of him rising from Seir. Deuteronomy 33 describes him as coming from Paran. Habakkuk 3 paints him descending from Teman in holy fury. These are not random poetic choices, they are geographic memory, the memory of a God whose roots were not in Israel, but in the lands to the south, in Edom, Midian, and the desolate wilderness that swallowed all who entered without permission. It is in Midian, where Moses encounters the burning bush, not in Canaan, not in Egypt. He meets Yahweh, not in a temple, but on a mountain in the desert, and the name he receives is both cryptic and ancient. Ehi, Asher, Ehi, I am who I am. Or in another reading, I will be who I will be. But hidden in that phrase is something more primal, a name older than theology, a name already known to others, Yahweh. When Moses fears the people will not believe him, he is told to invoke that name. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. But how did they already know it? The presence of the name Yu, Ear, in Egyptian records nearly a century before the traditional date of the Exodus suggests something powerful, that Yahweh was already worshipped, already named, already followed by groups who lived beyond Egypt's control, and the Israelites, when they emerged as a distinct identity, did not invent Yahweh. They inherited him, claimed him, entered into covenant with a God already roaming the hills. This challenges the later narrative, the idea that Yahweh is a self-revealed deity, wholly separate from the gods of other peoples. Instead, it places him within the spiritual ecology of the southern Levant, among nomads and mountain clans, worshipped in tents and caves long before his name was carved into scrolls. The Shasu of Yahweh were not Israelites, not yet, but they may have been the seed, and perhaps even more unsettling. If Yahweh's origins lie in Midian, what does that make Moses, raised in Egypt, fleeing into exile, marrying the daughter of a Midianite priest, encountering God not as a Hebrew prophet, but as an outsider, on foreign soil? His entire identity as prophet, as liberator, begins not in Israel, but in the territory of the Shasu, the territory of Yu. Could it be that the God Moses meets is not new to him, but already familiar, not by name, but by whisper, that the burning bush is not the first appearance of Yahweh, but the first acknowledgement that the Israelites' God is born from the margins, a deity of strangers, desert dwellers, those without a name or a home? The silence of the Shasu in later texts is deafening. They vanish from the Bible's pages, their name is erased, their legacy absorbed, but their God, their Yu, remains, elevated, refined, remade. Yet those old Egyptian inscriptions remain, untouched by doctrine, beyond revision. They speak of a time before narrative, a time when Yahweh's presence was a rumor among sand and stars. Egypt, with all its gods, Rod, Osiris, Thoth, had no place for Yahweh. He was not a sun god, not a river god, not a lord of balance. He brought no order, he carried no scales, he was storm and fire and wind. He could not be captured, he could only be feared. And in the imperial records of pharaohs who ruled the known world, Yahweh was just a name scratched into stone, attached not to a king, but to nomads. But names are seeds, and from that scratch in the rock,
From that brief note among gods now forgotten, grew a presence that would one day speak creation into being, silence prophets, and rain from heaven. The Egyptians did not understand what they had written, but they preserved it, unintentionally, unwillingly, eternally. There was a time when Yahweh belonged to no temple, when his worshippers walked with the stars, and vanished into the hills, a time when he was the God of the Shasu, of wind and fury, of exile and vision, of people who had nothing but the name, and somehow that name endured, not through conquest, not through empire, but through fire.
He does not arrive in silence. He does not whisper. He roars. He burns. He descends in flame, wrapped in smoke, clothed in lightning. His footsteps shake the mountains. His voice splits the sky. Wherever he moves, the air cracks, and the earth trembles. This is not the God of gentle blessings, nor the shepherd of peaceful pastures. This is Yahweh, as he first appears, not as creator, not as lawgiver, but as storm, fire, terror, a God not of light, but of collision, of violence, and awe. Before he speaks of morality, he speaks in thunder. Before he writes commandments, he scorches the peak of a mountain into a blackened altar. The earliest image of Yahweh is not painted in soft brushstrokes. It is carved by lightning into stone. In the oldest layers of scripture, long before theology reshaped his nature, Yahweh erupts onto the stage like a tempest given thought. In Exodus 19, he descends upon Mount Sinai in fire, smoke billows like a furnace. Thunder rolls across the wilderness. The people tremble, and even Moses is afraid. The mountain does not symbolize his presence. It becomes his body, his throne, his altar. The summit becomes untouchable. If even a stray animal steps upon it, it must be stoned or shot with arrows, not because of ritual impurity, but because the storm god is there, and he is not safe. Every detail of this moment drips with the iconography of the ancient Near Eastern storm deity: fire, cloud, darkness, thunder, and the mountain. All of these are markers used for centuries to describe gods like Baal, Adad, and Teshub. Yahweh speaks in their vocabulary, commands with their gestures, but he does something more. He takes the language of the storm and infuses it with moral gravity, with covenant, with blood, and law. The storm is no longer random. It has intent, personality, memory. Psalm 18 sings of a God who mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence clouds advanced, with hailstones and bolts of lightning. This is not metaphor. This is ancient imagery, drawn directly from the storm traditions of Mesopotamia and Canaan, where the gods did not simply rule the weather, they were the weather, and so too is Yahweh. He is not beyond the storm. He is the storm. His earliest appearances reflect this overwhelming power. In the Song of Deborah, one of the most ancient texts in the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh is described as marching from Seir, from the mountains of Edom. The earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water, the mountains quaked before Yahweh, the one of Sinai. This description is not abstract, it is meteorological, a storm god approaching from the desert, bringing thunder and quaking the mountains, a god whose arrival rewrites the weather, whose voice becomes the storm front. Even his protection is violent. In Exodus 14, when the Israelites flee from Pharaoh's army and find themselves trapped by the sea, it is not calm or serenity that saves them, it is chaos. The wind of Yahweh blows all night, the waters split, the Israelites cross, and then the same forces crash down upon the Egyptians: thunder, fire, cloud, and drowning. His mercy is not soft, it is the mercy of a storm that kills your enemies. A God who fights with the sky. This alignment with war is not a late addition, it is foundational. Yahweh is first introduced in Exodus 15 as Yahweh Ish Milkamah,
Yahweh is a man of war. The song that follows is not about justice, it is about destruction. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The deep waters have covered them, they sank to the depths like a stone. His right hand, the text says, shattered the enemy. This is not the poetry of philosophy, it is the celebration of a war god who wins, a storm deity who protects his people, not through negotiation, but through annihilation, and he does not stop. In Numbers, when the Israelites rebel, fire from Yahweh breaks out among them and consumes the outskirts of the camp. In Deuteronomy, he leads them into the promised land, not with love, but with the sword. He commands the destruction of the Canaanites, the tearing down of altars, the burning of cities. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. These are not the commands of a distant creator. These are the commands of a God whose presence is battlefield smoke, whose righteousness is blood-soaked. Yahweh does not only accompany war, he is war. This storm God carries with him not only terror, but revelation. The lightning does not just blind, it writes. The fire does not only burn, it speaks. In the book of Job, Yahweh answers not from the temple, not from a throne, but from the whirlwind. The storm is his voice, the chaos is his pulpit, and what he says is not comfort, but rebuke. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand. He speaks of sea monsters, of thunderbolts reporting to him like soldiers, of feeding the lions, of birthing snow. He speaks not as a moral guide, but as a cosmic storm, whose logic cannot be questioned. He does not explain suffering, he overwhelms it. This use of storm as presence, of war as identity, aligns Yahweh not only with regional traditions, but with the earliest instincts of humanity, to see divinity in the most uncontrollable forces of nature. The storm is beyond reason, beyond resistance. It comes, it destroys, it nourishes, it vanishes. A power that cannot be predicted must be worshipped. Then a God who commands it becomes King of gods. But Yahweh is different from the others. He does not remain content with weather. He transforms the storm into covenant. He binds the thunder to a people. The lightning no longer strikes at random. It becomes a sign, a judgment, a call. Sinai burns not just to terrify, but to give law. The storm becomes scripture, the fire, foundation. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes his first vision of God as a whirlwind from the north, a great cloud with flashing fire and brilliant light, and within it, something like glowing metal. Creatures with wings and wheels appear, their movements like bolts of lightning. This is not symbolic, it is a storm vision. Yahweh arrives as electricity and cloud, as machinery of the divine whirlwind. His chariot is not drawn by horses, but by elemental forces. His presence is not warm, it is incandescent, terrifying. In the temple in Jerusalem, his presence fills the inner sanctum like smoke, not metaphorical incense, literal cloud. The priests cannot perform their duties, they fall back. The God of Sinai has not changed, he has only moved indoors. And yet, for all this power, there is something deeply human about a storm god. He is not unreachable, he is unpredictable, yes, but he is present. He is not the cold perfection of later theology. He is rage and tenderness, fury and protection. He loves fiercely, and he punishes with equal heat. He is a God who travels, who speaks, who burns. He is not tamed, and he does not want to be. In the echoes of Ugaritic myth, we find a template for all of this. Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites, also descends upon mountains. He also defeats the sea. He also dies and rises again in thunder. But Yahweh does something Baal never did. He absorbs all roles. He is not only storm, he is law, he is covenant, he is exile, he is return. But in the beginning, before temples, before scrolls, before priests in linen robes, he was fire. He was the mountain that burned, the wind that howled through the rocks, the voice that made the sky tremble. He has not left that place. Even now, buried beneath centuries of theology and translation, the storm god waits, not in the heavens, in the mountain, in the silence before the thunder. in the smoke that rises when holiness comes too close, in the fire that still burns but does not consume.
He did not begin alone. The throne he sits upon today was once shared, divided, contested, long before Yahweh's name echoed through temples and synagogues. Two other gods stood at the center of divine power in the ancient Near East, El and Baal. One was the father of creation, the quiet architect of the cosmos. The other, a fiery stormbringer, a god of war, rain, and resurrection. They were not just distant myths. They were worshipped, feared, and written into stone centuries before Yahweh emerged from the wilderness. And yet, their legacy did not vanish. It was consumed. Their voices became his, their powers absorbed, their stories rewritten, not erased, but transformed, folded into the ever-expanding shadow of Yahweh, who would take their crowns one by one and wear them as his own. El was the beginning, not in Genesis, but in the deep mythic soil of Ugarit, on the coast of ancient Syria. Tablets buried in the ruins of Ras Shamra tell of a high god named El Elon, the Most High. He was not a warrior. He did not wield thunder or march into battle. He was old, bearded, enthroned, the father of gods and humans. He ruled by decree, not by sword. His name means simply God, and to those who worshipped him, he was the source of all creation. His dwelling was not in heaven, but on a sacred mountain by the sea, surrounded by rivers of life. He had a wife, Asherah. He had 70 sons, and he ruled with wisdom, not fury. It is this El, whose name appears again and again in the oldest biblical phrases, not as Yahweh's enemy, but as his prototype. Abraham calls upon El Elon. Melchizedek is priest of El. Jacob builds altars to El Bethel. These are not poetic accidents. They are echoes of a time before Yahweh was the only name in the sky. In Deuteronomy 32, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we read, "When El Elon gave the nations their inheritance, he fixed the borders according to the number of the sons of El, but Yahweh's portion was his people." In this oldest form of the text, El is the high God who assigns the nations, and Yahweh is one among his sons, given Israel as his lot. This is a world with hierarchy, with divine plurality, and Yahweh, in this early layer, is not the creator. He is the chosen, a son of El, a regional god within a greater divine assembly. But over time that assembly dissolves. El fades. His attributes, timelessness, fatherhood, cosmic authority, begin to appear in Yahweh. The name El becomes one of Yahweh's many titles: El Shaddai, El Elon, El Roy. The transformation is slow, but it is deliberate. Yahweh does not slay El, he becomes El. The high God does not vanish in war, he is devoured in doctrine. And then there is Baal, the storm god, the rider on the clouds, the victor over death and sea. His name means Lord, and for centuries, he was exactly that. He was the thunder above Canaan, the rain that turned dust into grain, the hero of myth and ritual. In the Ugaritic cycle, Baal battles Yam, the chaotic sea, and defeats him with twin thunderclubs. He then builds his palace on Mount Zaphon, the divine mountain of the north, and rules with power and fertility. But his rule is not uncontested. Mot, the god of death, drags Baal to the underworld. Nature withers, drought falls upon the land. Yet Baal rises again, restored by his sister Anat. Life returns, the rains fall, the cycle begins anew. This myth was not a story for entertainment. It was the heartbeat of agricultural life. Baal was the storm, the resurrection, the hope that the season would turn, that the dead would rise, that the rains would come again. His temples crowned the hills. His priests cut themselves with knives in ritual ecstasy. His name was carved in stone and sung in thunder. And yet, Yahweh, when he emerges, speaks with Baal's voice. He too rides on the clouds. Psalm 68 declares,
Sing to God, who rides upon the clouds. His name is Yah. This phrase, rider on the clouds, is Baal's title. It appears almost word for word in Ugaritic texts. Yahweh's storms, his thunder, his lightning, all mirror Baal's iconography. Even his holy mountain, Sinai, shrouded in smoke and fire, evokes Zaphon, Baal's cosmic seat. The transition is not hidden. In many ways, it is poetic revenge. Baal, the great rival, is not denied. He is transformed. His symbols are emptied of name and filled with a new one. His title becomes Yahweh's. His reigns, his voice, his battles, all absorbed. And in the book of Job, the sea monster Leviathan, a cousin to the Ugaritic Lotan, whom Baal slays, is crushed by Yahweh. The chaos dragon falls again, but the hand that slays it now is new. The prophets reflect this uneasy inheritance. In Hosea, Yahweh thunders against his people for calling him Baali, my Lord. It is not the meaning of the word, but the association, the memory, the rival. Yahweh does not want to be mistaken for the God he replaced, but the confusion is understandable. The names are close, the attributes nearly identical. Baal's temples were torn down, but his thunder lived on, and that thunder, now Yahweh's, still rolled across the mountains. This fusion of El and Baal into Yahweh is not mere speculation. It is written into the texts themselves. Yahweh is described in El's terms, eternal, fatherly, enthroned. He is praised in Baal's terms, stormy, wrathful, resurrecting. The Bible does not deny these parallels, it reflects them. The Psalms sing of Yahweh as creator and warrior, judge and cloud rider. The prophets speak of his storms, his fury, his fertile blessings. Yahweh becomes both high God and storm God, both El and Baal. But unlike El, Yahweh is not passive. Unlike Baal, he does not die. He takes their roles and discards their weaknesses. He becomes what they were, and more. The Bible tells us Yahweh made the heavens and the earth. He commands sea and sky. He controls the seasons. He thunders in judgment and shelters in mercy. He becomes singular, unchallenged, alone, and yet fragments remain. In Deuteronomy 33, Yahweh rises from Seir and shines from Mount Paran, a storm god's entrance. In Psalm 29, the voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars, shakes the wilderness, and flashes flames of fire, a storm god's power. In Genesis 1, he creates the world through speech, an El-like act. In Job, he battles chaos, a Baal-like feat. He is both, and yet neither. The absorption is so complete that the earlier gods vanish, not in defeat, but in transformation. Their temples fall, their names fade, but their essence endures, hidden within the thunder, embedded in the law, riding the wind that once blew for other names. This process is not unusual in ancient religion. Gods often merged, evolved, adapted, but in Yahweh's case, the fusion became final. The divine consolidation was so total that future generations would forget the others ever existed. El became a name for Yahweh. Baal became a rival to be hated, and Yahweh, once a desert god of fire, now held the sky, the throne, the storm, and the scroll. But beneath the surface, the old bones still lie. El seated by the sea, Baal rising from the underworld. Their stories live on, recast, renamed, reborn, in the fire of a god who refused to share his mountain. Yahweh did not slay his rivals, he became them.
She stood beside him once, but history would rather forget. Her name was whispered in the shadows of temples, etched into stone, and sung in rituals long silenced. She was Asherah, Queen of Heaven, Mother of Gods, and for a time, perhaps the wife of Yahweh, not in metaphor, not in poetry, but in worship, real, tactile, undeniable. Her presence was once carved into the hearts of the faithful, but as Yahweh rose to exclusivity, she was pushed into exile, torn from the scriptures, burned from the memory of a religion that would no longer allow a goddess at his side. Yet the stones remember, in the dry hills of Kuntalet Adrud, a remote desert outpost dating back to the 8th century BCE. Archaeologists made a discovery that shook the foundations of biblical scholarship. Among the fragments of pottery and shattered inscriptions, they found a phrase repeated more than once: "Blessed be you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." The language is casual, confident, not heretical. It speaks of Asherah not as an enemy or foreign god, but as someone who belongs, someone who is, someone beside Yahweh. What does it mean? Some argue that Asherah in these inscriptions refers not to the goddess herself, but to a cultic object, perhaps a sacred pole or tree symbolizing fertility. But this explanation, while safe, is not satisfying. Asherah was not just a totem. She was one of the most widely worshipped goddesses in the ancient Near East. In Ugaritic texts, she is Asherah, the consort of El, the high god. She dwells by the sea, mother of 70 divine sons, a figure of fertility, sexuality, and life. Her power is elemental, her presence maternal. She is not ornamental. She is divine. And if Yahweh once began as a subordinate to El, as the Bible itself hints in its oldest layers, then inheriting El's throne might have included inheriting his queen. The evidence does not end in the desert. At Khirbet el-Kom, another ancient Judean site, an inscription scratched into a tomb wall echoes the same pattern: "Blessed is Uri Yahweh, by Yahweh, and by his Asherah. From his enemies he has saved him." This is not a curse or warning. It is a prayer, a request for protection. Yahweh and his Asherah together form the source of blessing and salvation. The name of the goddess is not hidden. It is invoked. These inscriptions date from a time before the great reforms, before monotheism became law, before the temples were cleansed, the idols smashed, the scrolls rewritten. In these moments, Yahweh was not alone. He stood in a divine pair, God and goddess, strength and fertility, sky and womb. The model was not new. It mirrored Canaanite religion, where Baal had Anna, El had Asherah. Divine couples were not the exception. They were the structure, and for a time, even Yahweh, the God who would one day become solitary, walked that ancient pattern. The Bible remembers her, but only to condemn. In 1 Kings, Asherah is associated with sacred groves and high places. The writer speaks of Asherah, plural, as abominations. King Josiah, in his great purge of idolatry, burns down the altars of Asherah, grinds her poles to dust, desecrates her images. In 2 Kings 23, we read that he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem, burned it, beat it to dust, and cast the dust upon the graves. Not just destruction, Ereshurah, but if there was no Asherah, why destroy her? If she had never stood beside Yahweh, never been honored in his name, why mention her at all? The violence of these passages betrays the memory they are trying to erase. You do not grind to dust a fiction. You do not cast out a God who was never invited in. The temple itself once housed her. In 2 Kings 21, during the reign of King Manasseh, we are told he set up an Asherah in the temple of the Lord. A shocking claim, not because of the act, but because it appears in the text without disbelief. This was not some rogue action. It was a memory, a restoration perhaps, of what had once been normal. The reformers hated her, but the people, they had loved her, prayed to her, asked her for children, for rain, for protection. She was a goddess of the hearth, of birth, of the sacred tree. She was not foreign, she was familiar. Even the iconography survives. Terracotta figurines, unearthed across ancient Judah and Israel, depict a female form with exaggerated breasts, hands cupped beneath them, symbols of nurture, of fertility. These are not Roman imports. They date to the 10th to 7th centuries BCE, the very time when Yahweh worship was consolidating.
Scholars debate whether they represent Asherah, Astarte, or some unnamed goddess, but they appear in homes, in sanctuaries, in shrines, mass-produced, ubiquitous, a silent testimony to a forgotten presence. The biblical authors, in their later redactions, replaced the feminine with fire. Yahweh becomes the lone actor, the giver of life, the comforter, and the destroyer. The space for divine femininity shrinks until it vanishes. Wisdom, once personified as a woman in Proverbs, calling from the streets, is folded back into Yahweh. The spirit, the mother, the womb, all absorbed. The queen is dethroned, the throne made for one, but the memory remains in cracks and fragments, in prayers scratched by trembling hands, in buried statues, in broken altars. Asherah was not erased by logic, she was erased by force, and even then, not completely. Why was she cast out? Because a lone God is more powerful, because a single masculine deity mirrors the authority of kings, because patriarchal structure needed heaven to reflect earth, because a goddess beside Yahweh meant compromise, balance, duality, and in a time of war, exile, and rebuilding, theology hardened. Yahweh could not afford partners, not in the heavens, not on earth, and yet, there was a time when his name was spoken with hers, when blessings were given in their joint presence, when Yahweh and Asherah were a pair, not in competition, but in union, a divine marriage, a cosmic harmony, hidden now beneath centuries of redaction and denial. The gods of the ancient world were never alone. They were families, courts, lovers. Yahweh's journey from tribal deity to universal creator required solitude, but it began in company. Asherah's presence may now be whispered only in the dust, but she was once carved into stone beside his name, not enemy, not idol, not heresy, divine, and still, somewhere in the cracked altars of time, her name lingers.
Before Yahweh thundered from Sinai, before his name split temples and reshaped kingdoms, another divine order ruled the world. It was ancient when Abraham was born, older than Moses, older than Canaan. It whispered through ziggurats and blood rites, its hymns scratched into clay, long before scrolls carried the name of Israel's God. This was the realm of the Mesopotamian gods, Enlil, Enki, Marduk, lords of storm, wisdom, judgment, and war. Their presence shaped the world for over 2,000 years, their names echoing through myth and memory. And though Yahweh would one day claim all power for himself, his rise did not occur in a vacuum. The storm he rode, the tablets he wrote upon, the flood he sent, the enemies he crushed, these were shadows cast long before by gods whose faces have turned to dust, but their fingerprints remain, pressed deep into the foundation of the deity who would replace them. In the Sumerian pantheon, Enlil stood at the center of divine authority. He was the god of air, of wind, of decrees. He controlled the fates of gods and men alike, his word as binding as gravity. When the gods held council, it was Enlil who presided. He granted kingship. He expelled the first humans from paradise when they disobeyed. He was the keeper of the me, the fundamental laws of existence, and his temple, the Iker in Nippur, was the heart of the cosmos. Yahweh, in his earliest portrayals, shares this role of supreme authority. He issues law, not as suggestion, but as decree. He separates peoples, raises kings, breaks nations. His word becomes flesh, covenant, destiny. Like Enlil, he is not bound by consensus. He is the council. Enlil was also a god of wrath. When humanity became too noisy, he sent a flood to silence them, not out of evil, but divine irritation. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil decrees the destruction of mankind. The parallels to the Genesis flood are uncanny. In both stories, a single righteous man is chosen to survive. Atrahasis in one,
Noah in the other. A boat is built, animals are saved, the waters rise, then recede, the gods regret their fury, and the world begins anew. But behind both tales stands the figure of the storm god, not Marduk, not Baae, Enlil, the one whose breath could tear cities from the ground. Then there is Enki, Enlil's brother, god of water, wisdom, fertility, and deep knowledge. He is the trickster, the teacher, the silent guardian of balance. While Enlil sends destruction, Enki whispers salvation. He warns Atrahasis. He teaches humans to build. He speaks in dreams. He is the unseen voice of guidance. In the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh blends these roles, Enlil's judgment and Enki's mercy. He is both flood and rescue, fire and stillness. When he destroys Sodom, he saves Lot. When he sends plagues, he also heals. He gives the law, but also the prophets. The fusion is striking. Yahweh becomes the storm and the whisper, the judge and the wellspring, the destroyer and the redeemer, a god of paradox, as if he inherited the voices of both brothers and made them one. And then comes Marduk, the god who would conquer gods. In the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, Marduk rises above all other deities to defeat the chaos dragon Tiamat. He slays her, splits her body, and from her corpse creates the heavens and the earth. He then takes the tablets of destiny, the right to rule the cosmos, and becomes king of the gods. The story is violent, cosmic, filled with thunder and stars, but it is not just myth. It is theology. It is empire. Marduk becomes the symbol of Babylon's supremacy, a divine justification for political power. And Yahweh, he too slays chaos. In Psalm 74, he crushes the heads of Leviathan and breaks the waters of the deep. In Isaiah, he stretches out the heavens and tramples the sea. He alone rules. He alone speaks creation into being. The echoes of Marduk are everywhere, not in name, but in structure. The chaos Kampf, the war against the abyss, the enthronement of a single deity. These are themes borrowed not from the imagination of desert tribes alone, but from centuries of mythos, inscribed in cuneiform. Even the language betrays inheritance. Yahweh is called Elyon, the Most High. So was Enlil. He is called King of Heaven. So was Enyu. He is Lord of Hosts, Judge of the earth, Father of spirits. So were they. The divine council Yahweh sits within, mentioned in Psalms and Job, mirrors the heavenly assemblies of Mesopotamian myth. The watchers, the scribes, the divine messengers, they are not inventions. They are imports, remnants of a worldview where heaven functioned like a kingdom, and gods ruled with titles and thrones. But the most haunting resemblance is not in title or tale. It is in structure, the progression. Enlil was not always supreme. He rose in power, eclipsing Enyu. Marduk too began as a city god, humble, local, bounded by geography. But as Babylon grew, Marduk absorbed the powers of other gods. He took Enlil's titles. He wielded Ea's wisdom. He became not one among many, but the only one that mattered. A god elevated by empire, a pantheon absorbed into a single name. And Yahweh, he too began local, a storm god of the southern deserts, a warrior of Sinai, the God of Israel. But over time, he swallowed the heavens. Elad became his title, Bod Aae, shadow, Asherah, his silence. The divine names fell away, until only his remained. His evolution mirrors Marduk's, not in theology, but in strategy, from plurality to singularity, from myth to monotheism, from pantheon to presence. This is not to say Yahweh was a copy. He was something more dangerous, an inheritance. He rose in a world where gods ruled by mythic logic, where order emerged from chaos through divine violence, where the heavens were not empty, but crowded with thrones. Yahweh absorbed his patterns, reshaped them, and then declared them his alone. The flood, his; the storm, his; the council, his; the dragon's head crushed, his; the wisdom in the deep, his; the breath that formed man from clay, his, and the clay itself, still warm from Enki's hands. The scrolls that speak of Yahweh do not deny the past, they rewrite it. They take the bones of Mesopotamian memory and dress them in covenant. They replace the ziggurat with Sinai, the river with commandment, the city with wilderness, but the bones remain, ancient, familiar, sacred. In the end, Yahweh did not merely rise among gods. He became the mountain others once climbed, the storm others once rode, the wisdom others once whispered.
He was not alone, not yet. The words may now declare, there is no other, but there was a time, a long, complex, and dangerous time, when Yahweh stood among gods, not above them. The high places were full of names. The people sang to many. There were gods of the sun, of the moon, of fertility, of death. Boris still thundered over the northern hills. Chemosh ruled in Moab. Dagon's temples still echoed with prayers. Chemra watched from her sacred trees, and Yahweh was theirs, not the only, but the first, not the universal, but the personal, theirs by blood, by promise, by war. This was not yet monotheism. This was something more primal, more tribal, more honest. It was henotheism, the belief in many gods, with allegiance to only one. The Bible, even in its edited form, betrays traces of this forgotten age. It was not born with one God alone. It was shaped, molded, sharpened by centuries of competition, fusion, and fire. In the oldest texts, Yahweh is not declared to be the only God. He is declared to be the greatest, the most powerful, the mightiest among others. Psalm 82 shatters the silence. God stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods, plural, divine beings, a heavenly council. Yahweh is among them, not alone, but as the one who will judge them all. He accuses them of injustice. He threatens to cast them down. But they are real. They are present. The courtroom is full, and Yahweh in this scene is not denying their existence. He is confronting it. Deuteronomy 32, in its oldest preserved form, paints the world's division, not by accident, but by design. When Elohim gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of El. But Yahweh's portion is his people. The implications are thunderous. The Most High, not Yahweh but El, assigns the gods to their nations. 70 peoples, 70 divine patrons. Yahweh in this structure is one of them. He is given Israel, chosen, perhaps favored, but still one among many. It is a map of the cosmos with multiple thrones. The 10 Commandments do not begin with the denial of other deities. They begin with allegiance. You shall have no other gods before me. Not there are no other gods, but you will serve me first. The Hebrew phrase, al-pane, before my face, suggests competition. Other gods are acknowledged, but Yahweh demands loyalty. This is the voice of a jealous God, not jealous of fiction, but of rivals. The prophets thunder against foreign worship, not because it is foolish, but because it is forbidden. Elijah challenges the prophets of Bolismot with logic, but with fire. The gods are real enough to contest, and Yahweh must prove himself in their presence. On Mount Carmel, the question is not whether Bolis exists, it is whether Yahweh is stronger. He wins, but the battle implies plurality. The spectacle means nothing if the other gods are illusions. They are not illusions. They are competitors, and Yahweh for now is the victorious one. This was the spiritual landscape of early Israel, a world of divine options, of regional patrons, and sacred territories. Each nation had its god. Yahweh was Israel's. He was invoked in battle, sought in plague, worshipped with sacrifice, but not as the God of the universe, as the God of their land, their people, their covenant. Other nations had other gods.
The Israelites did not argue that those gods were fake, they simply argued that Yahweh was better, and yet, a shift was already beginning. A slow tectonic change in theology. While the common people may have prayed to many, the priests and scribes were starting to write differently. Their vision was political, prophetic, and absolute. A God who was simply greater was not enough. Yahweh had to be the only. But that vision was not yet realized. It began with devotion, with singular loyalty. The Shema, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one, is not yet a philosophical declaration of metaphysical monotheism. It is a pledge. Our God is Yahweh, our one, our only. It is nationalistic before it is cosmic. The archaeological record confirms the complexity. Altars dedicated to Yahweh and Asherah, inscriptions invoking both together, cultic sites where his name shares space with others, figurines of fertility goddesses found in Judean homes. It was not confusion, it was coexistence. Monotheism allowed it. You gave your devotion to one, but you lived in a world of many. Even the heavens were not empty. The term Elohim, used throughout the Hebrew Bible, is plural. Let us make man in our image. The text says in Genesis, the divine we. Commentators later twist this into metaphor, royal speech, or angelic consultation. But the original echoes are louder. It is the language of a world where the sky is crowded, where God speaks not in a void, but in a council. Job speaks of sons of God, who present themselves before Yahweh. Daniel describes watchers, heavenly beings, who render judgment. The Book of Kings mentions divine armies, spirits that go forth with Yahweh's permission. The pantheon never fully disappears, it is simply restructured. Yahweh remains at the top. But the assembly below still murmurs. What caused the shift? Perhaps it was trauma, the Babylonian exile, the destruction of the temple, the loss of land, of king, of certainty. The theology of national godhood shattered. Yahweh had not saved them. But he was not gone. The priests rebuilt him, not as a tribal god who failed, but as the only God, whose judgment had come. The exile became proof, not of Yahweh's weakness, but of his singular power. He was not defeated. He was punishing, and the gods of Babylon, empty idols, carvings, wood and gold, monotheism, in this moment, crystallized, but it had not always been so. And the long shadow of henotheism never vanished, even as the scribes revised the scrolls, even as Deuteronomy was reworded, even as kings like Josiah purged the land, the memory remained. In dusty inscriptions, in burnt offerings, in the songs of the people, Yahweh had not always stood alone. He had risen through a divine field of rivals, loved above them, chosen over them, lifted by devotion and blood and story, and only much later, declared to be the only one who had ever been. Henotheism was not heresy. It was foundation. It was the step before the leap, the twilight before dawn. And in its strange honesty, it reveals more than later doctrines dare admit. It tells us that Yahweh was not born in the heavens, fully formed, alone. He rose, he was loved, he was feared, and then he claimed the sky for himself.
The mountain of Yahweh was chosen not by heaven, but by kings. Jerusalem, the city of kings and blood, rose not only as a political heart, but as a spiritual singularity, a vortex that pulled all sacred energy into itself and crushed the old ways beneath its stones. Before the 7th century BCE, Yahweh had many homes. He was worshipped on hills and in valleys, under trees and in village shrines. He moved with the people, dwelled among the tribes, lingered in the wilderness. His presence was not bound by borders or walls, but that changed when the throne moved to enforce doctrine. When scrolls were rewritten, altars burned, and the cult of Yahweh was centralized by royal decree. The hand behind it was King Josiah, a reformer cloaked in righteousness, but whose shadow still stretches over history. Josiah ruled Judah during a time of chaos and opportunity. The Assyrian Empire, once an unstoppable force, was crumbling. Babylon had not yet taken its place. In this geopolitical pause, Josiah saw a chance to reshape the kingdom, not just politically, but spiritually. He declared that Yahweh would no longer be many, scattered in sacred groves and family shrines. Yahweh would be one, and his home would be Jerusalem, and only Jerusalem. This wasn't just faith, it was strategy. The Book of Kings tells the story with righteous fervor. Josiah discovers a book of the law during temple renovations, a text many scholars believe to be an early form of Deuteronomy. Its message is clear: worship only Yahweh, and only in the place he chooses, and that place, by royal coincidence, is the temple in Jerusalem. Whether Josiah found this scroll or commissioned it is still debated, but what followed is not. A sweeping purge of religious plurality. Altars throughout the land, even those dedicated to Yahweh, were torn down. Priests were dismissed, idols smashed. The high places, where Yahweh had been honored for generations, were defiled. Sacred trees cut, bones burned, sanctuaries razed. This was not the quiet rise of monotheism. It was a conquest, a spiritual coup. The inscriptions and archaeological evidence of the time reveal a very different reality than what later texts claim. For centuries, Israelite religion had been fluid. It adapted, shifted, absorbed. Yahweh had been worshipped alongside Asherah, perhaps Baalal, perhaps Elul. Villages had their own traditions, their own rituals. Yahweh was honored in many ways, sometimes even in the form of a golden calf, as at Bethel and Dan, where the northern kingdom had installed statues to represent him. These were not considered foreign gods, but local expressions of the same divine presence. But Josiah saw these as threats, not because they were false, but because they were uncontrolled. Centralization was a political act, disguised as theological purity. By making Jerusalem the sole seat of worship, Josiah consolidated not only faith, but power. All sacrifices would now flow into the temple. All festivals would be centered in the capital. All priestly authority would be aligned with the throne. The temple, a structure already revered, became the axis of everything, and the texts were rewritten to reflect this. The laws now declared, "You shall not offer your sacrifices in every place that you see, but only at the place that Yahweh your God will choose." And that place, of course, was no longer up for debate. What was lost in the purge is harder to quantify. The regional traditions, the family gods, the ancestral shrines, all swept away. The archaeological record shows a sudden and dramatic drop in household figurines. Symbols of Asherah vanish. Local cultic sites fall silent. The voices of village priests are replaced by silence, or by scripted prayers from Jerusalem. The biblical texts celebrate Josiah's reforms with glowing language. They say he did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, and turned to Yahweh with all his heart. But the underlying narrative is one of control, of theological imperialism. Yahweh, once a god who walked with nomads and spoke from burning bushes, was now confined to stone. He became a god of the temple, institutionalized, centralized, codified. The sacred became systematized, the divine became bureaucratic, and with this shift came a new kind of narrative. Yahweh was not just Israel's God, he was the only God. The high places were not just unauthorized, they were heretical. Other gods were not just rivals, they were illusions. The war was no longer against other tribes, but against other ideas. Orthodoxy was born, and with it the sword of doctrine. The story of Josiah's reform is echoed eerily in later religious movements, in the formation of creeds, the burning of heretical texts,
the closing of canon. But here, in Jerusalem, the blueprint was drawn. The temple became the interface between heaven and earth. The priesthood became gatekeepers of the divine, and Yahweh, once wild and untamed, was enthroned not just in heaven, but in the capital, under lock and key. And yet, the reform was not total. Beneath the surface, resistance lingered. Some continued to worship at ancestral shrines in secret. Old prayers still floated through the air during the festivals. And when Josiah died in battle at the hands of Pharaoh Necho, it was seen by some not as tragedy, but divine retribution. Had he gone too far? Had Yahweh rejected the very temple built in his name? Within a generation, Babylon would arrive. The temple would burn. The centralized cult would collapse into ashes, and the people, exiled, shattered, would begin to imagine Yahweh in new ways, without temple, without land, without kings. But in Josiah's moment, the pattern was set. Monotheism had a throne, Yahweh had a city, and Jerusalem had become the beating heart of a God who now demanded everything.
The temple was gone. The walls of Jerusalem lay in ruin, blackened with ash and choked with silence. The ark had vanished, either destroyed or hidden, its once holy presence now replaced by absence, so profound it tore at the soul of a nation. The smoke had not yet cleared when the questions began. Where was Yahweh? Had he abandoned them? Had he lost? For those exiled to Babylon, the trauma was not merely political, it was spiritual disintegration. Everything they had believed about their God, their identity, their chosenness, now lay buried beneath rubble. The house of Yahweh, the one house, was no more. The priests slaughtered, the people chained, the covenant shattered. And yet, out of this devastation, something unthinkable emerged. Not the end of Yahweh, but his expansion. Not defeat, but redefinition. In the ashes of Jerusalem, a new God began to rise. Not a new name, not a new myth, but a new paradigm. The God of Israel became the God of all. The Babylonian exile was not merely a historical event. It was a cosmic rupture, the trauma so profound that it forced the Israelites to look beyond the ruins and ask the most dangerous question of all. Had they misunderstood Yahweh from the beginning? In Babylon, the gods were many and mighty. Temples stretched into the clouds. Ziggurats touched the stars. Marduk reigned from the heights of Etemenanki. Rituals flowed like water through the empire, as rich and ancient as the Euphrates itself. And yet, it was Babylon who had triumphed. Marduk who had granted victory. Yahweh, it seemed, had been defeated. But the exiled priests, prophets and scribes refused that narrative. They forged another, one that reversed the logic of empire. If Yahweh allowed the destruction, it was not because he was weak, it was because he was just, because he was sovereign even over Babylon. And if that were true, if Yahweh had orchestrated even their exile, then he was not merely a God of Jerusalem, he was God, full stop. This was the pivot, the transformation, the moment when the tribal God began to dissolve into the universal. The God of hills and smoke, of sacrifices and thunder, became the God of time and space itself, no longer confined to a temple, no longer dependent on altars or priestly blood. In exile, Yahweh slipped his earthly bonds and became omnipresent, a God who could follow his people even into the heart of the enemy. The book of Ezekiel captures this metamorphosis in vision and fire. The prophet sees a chariot of divine glory, wheels within wheels, eyes within fire, not in Jerusalem, but in Babylon. The unthinkable has happened. The kavod Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh, has left the temple. It now moves. It travels. It is no longer anchored to stone. Ezekiel's God is mobile, transcendent, terrifying, a God of exile and storm, of judgment and rebirth. This vision reframes the disaster not as abandonment,
but as transformation. Yahweh had not been caged in the temple, he had only used it, until now. And then the words of 2nd Isaiah, the anonymous prophet writing during the later exile, drive the point deeper. No longer does Yahweh merely demand loyalty. Now he declares, I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me there is no God. This is no longer henotheism. This is no longer tribalism. This is monotheism, in full bloom. In the belly of Babylon, Yahweh speaks with a new voice, one that rivals the claims of Marduk, of Enlil, of all divine rivals. I form the light, and create darkness. I bring prosperity, and create disaster. I, Yahweh, do all these things. The God of Israel is now not just Savior, but Creator. The whole cosmos bends to His will. There is no room left for others. But this shift was not just theological, it was a weapon, a survival mechanism. In exile, the people had lost everything but memory, and so memory became myth. Myth became scripture, and scripture became armor. The scrolls were gathered, edited, rewritten. The stories of origin were reshaped to reflect a new truth. Yahweh had always been this way, the universal God hidden behind tribal mask. Genesis was revised to open not with covenant, but with creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Not El, not Marduk, not the sun, the moon, or the stars. Yahweh, now Elohim, crafted it all. This was theological defiance, a declaration that even Babylon's gods were nothing but echoes, empty idols in a world already spoken into existence by their God. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, had once told of Marduk defeating Tiamat and sculpting the cosmos from her corpse. But now, the exiled scribes offered an alternative. Yahweh did not battle chaos, he commanded it. There was no war, only speech. Let there be light. His power required no violence, no struggle, just intention. Order from word, reality from will. The exile also birthed a new kind of spirituality, inward, abstract, portable, without temple. Religion turned to text, to law, to memory. The priest became the scribe, the offering became the prayer, and the land, once the core of identity, became a longing, not a location. Yahweh now dwelled not in geography, but in story. He became the God of the scroll, the God of the past and future, binding his people across time rather than territory. But the paradox remained. Yahweh was now everywhere, but hidden, present, yet silent. No fire from heaven, no tablets from Sinai, no visible ark. The covenant still stood, but it had shifted from blood and stone to something spectral, carried in ritual, remembered in exile, yearned for in song. Psalms began to speak of Yahweh enthroned above the cherubim, not in Jerusalem, but in the highest heavens. Daniel saw visions of the Ancient of Days, seated upon a throne of flame. The God who once thundered from mountains now whispered in dreams, in apocalypses, in layered symbols. He was more powerful and more distant, and yet he survived. This is perhaps the greatest mystery of the exile, not that faith endured, but that it evolved. Most tribal gods perished with their cities. When temples fell, the gods often fell with them. But Yahweh transcended collapse. He shed his skin. He became something the ancient world had barely conceived. A God who did not need a land, a throne, or an army. A God who could be all, yet belonged to one. A God who did not merely rule over a people, but over being itself. And still, he remained Yahweh. He remembered their names, their exile, their longing. And in this strange fusion, the personal and the infinite, a new kind of God was born. One forged in fire, exile, silence. A God who could be prayed to beside the rivers of Babylon, and still answer. A God who could whisper across borders, through generations. A God who had once dwelled in a temple, and now was the temple.
There is a kind of silence that follows collapse, not absence, but something deeper, a silence that listens, that records, that begins, in its stillness, to rewrite everything. In Babylon, that silence took the shape of ink, clay, and parchment, reeds pressed against wax, and in those hidden places where scribes worked by firelight, among exiles who had lost their land, their temple, and almost their God, something remarkable unfolded. They did not abandon their story. They began to rewrite it, to revise it, to edit the scattered fragments of myth, law, poetry, and prophecy into something that had never existed before, a single, unified, divinely authored narrative. This was not deception, it was survival, it was revelation. Through redaction, the God who had once thundered from Sinai was now whispering from scrolls, and the scrolls would say, he had always been alone. The Hebrew Bible, as we know it, was not written in a single breath. It is a palimpsest of centuries, layers upon layers of older traditions, oral tales, royal propaganda, priestly regulations, and ecstatic visions. Before the exile, it was a scattered body, songs sung in courts, genealogies memorized by families, laws carved into stone, or remembered by priests. There was no Bible, there was no canon, there were stories, and gods, in the plural, Yahweh, El, Asherah, Baal, and there were tribes, each with their own memories, of creation, covenant, and catastrophe. But in exile, everything changed. The destruction of the temple was not just the fall of a building, it was the collapse of identity. The priests who had once performed sacrifices now became editors. The prophets who had once cried out in the streets became scribes, and the scrolls that had once been scattered became the instruments of something far more radical, the construction of monotheism through text. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books, did not descend whole from Sinai. It was forged across centuries, but it was shaped in exile. The priestly class, once guardians of temple rituals, now codified those rituals into law. The visions of Deuteronomy, with its centralized worship and zealous loyalty to Yahweh alone, were expanded and reinforced. The chaotic multiplicity of older traditions was smoothed into a singular, commanding voice. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The opening words of Genesis were likely written in Babylon by scribes who had seen temples to other gods and who needed to declare, above all, that only their God had created everything. And yet, the fingerprints of the past remain. The text still holds seams, contradictions, echoes of a time before monotheism. There are 2 creation stories in Genesis, one in which the world is formed through speech, the other in which Yahweh molds Adam from dust and walks among trees. There are duplications of events, 2 flood narratives, interwoven, 2 stories of Sarah and Pharaoh, 2 explanations of the name Yahweh. Scholars have long recognized these as the remnants of earlier traditions, once distinct, now stitched together by exilic editors into a single tapestry. They did not erase the past, they absorbed it. The names of God shift through the text: Elohim, El Shaddai, Yahweh, not arbitrarily, but because they come from different sources. In one tradition, God appears as a cosmic creator, in another, as a storm deity, in another still, as a tribal warrior. But in Babylon, these were no longer contradictions, they were unified attributes of the one God, the same God who had always been. The redactors did not merely combine texts, they retrofitted the past to fit a new theology. Yahweh was, is, and always would be the only God. The God. Even the genealogies were transformed. The sons of Noah are listed with meticulous precision, each assigned to a region or nation, creating a theological map of the world, with Israel at its heart. It was a new kind of sacred order, one in which Yahweh's sovereignty
extended not just over his people, but over all people. Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, now explained, not as random empires, but as divine instruments, or rivals within Yahweh's grand design. History itself was being reimagined as theology. Prophetic texts, too, were gathered and revised. The earlier cries of Isaiah, Amos, and Hosea, warnings against idolatry and injustice, were no longer warnings alone. In exile, they became proof. Yahweh had spoken. The people had not listened. The exile was not failure, but fulfillment of prophecy. The scrolls, once scattered, now confirmed each other. Every catastrophe had been foretold. Every silence had meaning. Even the Psalms, songs once sung in pilgrimage and battle, were anthologized. Some still bear traces of older theology. Among the gods, there is none like you, O Yahweh. God stands in the council of El. These verses were not erased, but recontextualized. They now served as poetic relics, reminders of a polytheistic past that Yahweh had long since eclipsed. The editorial process was not random. It was intentional, meticulous, driven by both faith and necessity. And it was political. The priestly writers, often referred to by scholars as the P source, had a vision of order, hierarchy, sacred space. Their additions to the text emphasized purity laws, ritual precision, the holiness of time and space. They recast the world as a temple, with Eden as the inner sanctuary, Sabbath as sacred time, and Israel as the priestly nation. Yahweh, in this cosmology, was no longer a tribal storm god. He was the architect of time, the designer of cosmos, the presence within the void. But alongside them, the Deuteronomists, associated with the book of Deuteronomy and the historical books of Joshua through Kings, were shaping the moral arc of the story. They emphasized covenant, obedience, consequence. For them, the exile was not a cosmic event, but a moral one. Israel had sinned. The punishment was just, but the hope, always, was return, restoration, a new covenant. Together, these streams converged into the narrative we now call the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. It is not a monolith. It is a mosaic of voices, eras, and theologies, but stitched together with a single guiding hand. Yahweh alone is God. No rivals, no consorts, no equals. The Babylonian scribes knew what they were doing. They were not historians. They were theologians, myth-makers, guardians of a new worldview. They did not fabricate out of nothing. They selected, revised, and framed. They turned memory into prophecy, ritual into law, history into destiny, and in doing so, they transformed Yahweh from a national deity into the eternal, infinite, only God. It was in exile that monotheism was written, not as a doctrine, but as a narrative, a sacred story that absorbed all others and made them vanish.
They did not arrive with crowns or armies. They came with eyes full of fire and voices that cracked the sky. They wore sackcloth, wandered alone, and spoke as if thunder lived inside their lungs. The prophets, feared, hated, ignored, and immortal, were not just preachers. They were reformers, saboteurs, disruptors of the old order. In a land overflowing with sacred groves, ancestral altars, and whispers to 100 names of God, they appeared like knives through silence, announcing that Yahweh would no longer share. They were not content to offer warnings. They came to unmake, to tear down shrines, to burn idols, to crush statues with bloodied hands. They were not just voices, they were revolutions. The prophets of ancient Israel and Judah did not speak in times of peace. The cries rose during civil war, foreign occupation, and moral decay. They spoke to kings who silenced them, priests who feared them, and people who refused to listen. And still, they shouted. What they proclaimed was not gentle. It was not comforting. It was terrifying. Yahweh, they said, was not one among many. He was not to be shared with bows. honored beside Ashura, or invoked through golden calves. He was jealous, burning with fury, demanding exclusive worship, and all who defied him, king or peasant, would be swept away in the coming storm. One by one they came. Elijah, wild-eyed and cloaked in animal skin, stood alone on Mount Carmel against 450 prophets of bows. His challenge was simple: let fire fall from the sky. The prophets of bows wailed and cut themselves, crying to a God who did not answer. Elijah prayed once, then fire consumed the altar, the stones, the water, the dust. It was not just a miracle, it was a declaration. Bows were a declaration. The Oswald did not end there. He hunted the prophets of Ashura, tore down their sacred poles, cursed the king and queen who fed them. Jezebel, queen of Israel, high patroness of Bozwala, sent assassins. Elijah fled into the wilderness, begging for death. But Yahweh was not finished with him. A wind tore through the rocks, an earthquake shook the ground, a fire scorched the mountain top. But Yahweh was not in the fire, or the quake, or the wind. He was in the stillness, a whisper hidden beneath the storm. And from that whisper, Elijah rose again. Then came Hosea, who married a prostitute to mirror Israel's betrayal. Every act of infidelity, every visit to a shrine of Bozwalas, every offering to Ashura, was adultery. Yahweh was not a God who tolerated sharing. He was a husband betrayed, a lover scorned, and his wrath would be that of a wounded heart. But even in Hosea's fury, there was longing, a promise that Yahweh would take his people back, but only when they destroyed the idols and returned to him alone. Isaiah walked naked through the streets to prophesy humiliation. Jeremiah wept over a people who refused to listen. He smashed a clay jar at the temple gates, crying that Yahweh would shatter the nation like pottery. Ezekiel, in Babylon, lay on his side for months, cooked food over dung, shaved his hair with a sword, all to show how deeply Yahweh had been dishonored. They were not just speakers, they were living omens. They embodied the collapse of polytheism in their very flesh. But the enemy was not distant. It was within. It was the grove outside the village, where women weaved garments for Asherah. It was the household gods hidden in cupboards, the incense lit in the high places, the quiet prayers to Boz when rain refused to fall. These were not foreign practices, they were ancient, embedded, beloved. Boz was not a demon. He was the god of storms, fertility, harvest. His name meant Lord, and Asherah, his consort, or perhaps Yahweh's, was the mother of life. Her symbol was the tree, her image carved into wood and stone, placed beside Yahweh in the temple itself. She had been worshipped beside him for generations. The prophets came to tear this world apart. They did not only condemn false gods, they attacked the very idea of multiple sanctities. The high places, hilltop shrines, where Yahweh had once been worshipped, were now called abominations. Altars not built in Jerusalem were declared illegitimate. Even practices once allowed, offerings, rituals, pilgrimages, were now condemned if they occurred outside the temple. The message was clear. Yahweh was not just exclusive in identity, he was exclusive in location. Worship him alone, in the place he chooses, or die. The political consequences were enormous. Prophets often stood in direct opposition to kings. When Ahab built altars to Bozwalas, Elijah cursed him. When Manasseh filled Jerusalem with foreign gods, the prophets cried that blood would flood the streets. Josiah, whose reforms burned Asherah's image and crushed Boz priests, was likely inspired by these voices. But other kings resisted. They clung to the old ways, the plural gods, the ancestral traditions. The prophets then became outlaws. Jeremiah was beaten, imprisoned, thrown into a cistern. Amos was exiled.
Zechariah was stoned in the temple courtyard. Their blood watered the soil of monotheism. And yet, they were relentless. Their words, recorded and preserved, became the backbone of post-exilic faith. When the temple fell, it was seen not as failure, but as fulfillment. The prophets had warned it would come. When the people were dragged to Babylon, the prophets said it was Yahweh's justice. And when hope seemed lost, the prophets promised restoration. But only if the people abandoned all other gods. Even in exile, the war against Boswellus and Asherah continued. The scribes redacted the texts, purged polytheistic traces, reshaped stories. They inserted prophetic warnings into historical books, aligning past events with divine judgment. The Deuteronomistic editors, working during and after the exile, wove the voices of the prophets into a grand narrative of sin, punishment, and redemption. Every defeat became a sermon, every victory a reward for faithfulness. The prophets were no longer just reformers, they were theological architects, but the memory of their struggle remained raw. In the margins of the text, their frustration bleeds through. They have eyes, but do not see, ears but do not hear. My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn for themselves cisterns that can hold no water. The prophets did not only rage, they mourned. They mourned a people who loved idols, who clung to the sacred feminine, who refused to believe that Yahweh would truly act. And yet, he did. By the time the exiles returned from Babylon, the prophets were no longer madmen, they were legends. Their scrolls were read aloud. Their warnings had come true, and their dreams, of a purified people, of exclusive devotion, of a God who would be all in all, began to take form.
The sacred text, revered across centuries, does not hide its war. It is written into the margins, spoken through curses, etched in blood. The Bible is not merely a collection of holy wisdom. It is a battlefield. Its pages bear witness to the long, grinding struggle to seize the soul of a people and chain it to one God alone. And the proof is not in silence, but in obsession. The frequent, almost compulsive mentions of Baal, Asherah, Chemosh, Molech, the gods of Sidon, Moab, and Egypt. They are not incidental. They are not background. They are evidence of a world where Yahweh's place was not assured, a world where worship was fluid, plural, and constantly shifting, a world the priests and prophets were desperately trying to control. From the very beginning, the text betrays this tension. You shall have no other gods before me. Not, there are no other gods. Not, I am the only one, but no others before me. The commandment does not deny the existence of rivals. It acknowledges them. It places Yahweh at the top of a hierarchy that still seethes with divine presence. The gods of the nations were real, feared, named, and sometimes invoked by the Israelites themselves. The biblical writers knew this, and so they set to work. The Bible is filled with the language of polemic, of denunciation, of ritual purification, because the enemy was always present, just over the hill, or worse, inside the house. The high places were not foreign, they were in Judah. The sacred poles to Asherah stood beside Yahweh's altars. The bronze serpent, once lifted by Moses, became an object of idolatry. Even the temple itself had once housed images and symbols the later reformers would call abominations. These were not the practices of outsiders. They were the inherited traditions of a people who had once seen no contradiction in worshipping Yahweh and others. And so the texts were written not to describe what had always been, but to shape what must now be enforced. The prophets screamed because the people would not stop. The reformers wrote laws because the shrines kept reappearing. The kings issued purges because old altars rose from the soil like weeds. Yahweh's dominance had to be carved into the landscape and into memory. And so the Bible became not just a narrative of faith, but a manual of control. It is a document of conquest, not only over land, but over imagination. Take Deuteronomy, that strange and fiery book discovered during temple renovations in Josiah's reign. Its tone is not gentle, it is obsessive, authoritarian, absolute. Tear down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire. It repeats itself like a spell. Do not forget, do not turn, do not worship others. It redefines faith, not as love alone, but as loyalty, total, unwavering, and exclusive. And where there is disloyalty, there must be punishment. The Bible becomes law, law becomes power, and power demands elimination. This is not metaphor. Archaeological evidence confirms the battle. In earlier strata, household figurines of goddesses are common, often assumed to represent Asherah. They appear in homes, shrines, rural sanctuaries. They are not crude or hidden. They are central, cherished. But after the reforms, and especially after the exile, they vanish, not gradually, suddenly, destroyed, buried, abandoned. It is the silence of suppression, the erasure of an entire divine feminine. And in the text, the absence is matched by denunciation. The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. This line, from the book of Jeremiah, is not a neutral observation, it is an indictment. The old religion is being criminalized, and yet the need to mention them never stops. If Yahweh were truly alone, why does the Bible speak so constantly of other gods? Why name them, warn against them, and trace their worship across centuries? The answer is simple: because they were real to the people, because they did not fade easily, because belief is not a switch to be flipped, but a forest to be cleared, root by sacred root. The text reflects the fear of relapse, the anxiety of failure, the memory of a time when Yahweh was one name among many. Even the narratives are tools of control. The story of Solomon, wise, powerful but ultimately damned, is shaped to show the consequences of syncretism. He marries foreign women, he builds temples to their gods, he allows the sacred pluralism that had always defined Israel. And for this, the kingdom is split. The text is a warning: tolerate others, and everything falls apart. The Bible does not describe a monotheistic culture, it creates one, and to do so, it rewrites the past. The patriarchs, once tribal chieftains, who likely honored multiple deities, are retrofitted as early monotheists. The stories are edited, merged, retold. Older names for God, El Elon, El Shaddai, are reinterpreted as titles of Yahweh. Competing divine personalities are fused, domesticated, absorbed. Yahweh becomes everything: the storm god, the warrior, the creator, the judge, the healer, the lover, the executioner. Every divine function once held by others is now placed within him. And yet, the echoes remain, traces of older myths, of ancient memories that could not be fully erased. Even the act of canonization, the selection of which texts would be considered holy, is part of this control. Books that challenged the monotheistic project were excluded. Stories that hinted at polytheism were edited. The Council of Yahweh, once depicted with multiple divine beings, becomes angels. The sons of God, who take human wives in Genesis, are later reinterpreted to align with the singular vision. Psalm 82, where God stands in the divine council and judges other gods, is not a forgotten myth. It is a reminder of what the editors could not fully purge. What emerges is not purity, but victory. The Bible, in its final form, is the triumph of Yahweh's exclusivity. It is the aftermath of war. Every line that condemns Baal is a scar. Every mention of Asherah, a ghost. Every law that prohibits idols
is a locked door, built not to keep out foreign gods, but to trap the mind within a new order. It is theology as architecture, worship as obedience, and memory as battlefield. The Bible is sacred, but it is also strategy. It is scripture and suppression, revelation and redaction. It tells us not only who Yahweh is, but who he defeated to become that God. And in its pages, if one reads carefully, the vanquished voices still whisper.
There is power in names, power in how they are spoken, how they are hidden, how they evolve. And among all the names whispered across the deserts of ancient Canaan, none is more paradoxical, more enigmatic than Elohim. On the surface, it is simple, the Hebrew word for God, used over 2,000 times in the Bible, but beneath its letters lies a riddle, a crack in the surface of monotheism, through which the ancient past still breathes. For Elohim is not singular, it is plural, not God, but gods. The ending is unmistakable. The Hebrew suffix im marks a masculine plural form. Cherub becomes cherubim, serub becomes seraphim, and El, the ancient Semitic word for God, becomes Elohim, literally, gods. Yet, the Bible often pairs this plural noun with singular verbs. Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Elohim said, "Let there be light." The subject is plural. The action is singular. The grammar fractures. Something strange is happening. This has not gone unnoticed. For centuries, theologians, scholars, and mystics have tried to resolve the dissonance. The standard explanation, developed long after the text itself, is that Elohim is a plural of majesty, a royal we, a mark of grandeur, not multiplicity. But this idea is foreign to early Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew kings do not speak of themselves in plural, nor do they receive plural names. The concept of a majestic plural enters Jewish and Christian interpretation centuries after the earliest texts were written. It is not an answer. It is a reframing, a way to smooth over something too dangerous to leave exposed, because the truth is more ancient, more unsettling. Before Yahweh became the one, he was among many, and before the Bible was shaped into a single voice, it echoed with many names. Elo, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. Besaul, the storm god. Asherah, the mother goddess. These were not enemies in the beginning, they were family. In Ugaritic texts, El is called Father of Years, the wise patriarch of the divine council. Besaul, his son or rival, battles the sea god, Yam, and builds a palace in the sky. Asherah walks among them as consort and queen. Together, they govern the heavens and the earth, and in the oldest strata of Israelite religion, Yahweh was one among these divine beings. A warrior, a storm god, a name carried by nomads and desert tribes. The use of Elohim, then, is not a grammatical accident. It is a survival, a fossil of this earlier time, when the gods were many, and the lines between them still shifting. In some biblical passages, this becomes explicit. God stands in the council of El. Among the gods, he renders judgment. Psalm 82. A vision of Yahweh presiding over other divine beings, not angels but gods, called Elohim. He accuses them of injustice, and warns them, "You are gods, but you will die like mortals." The text does not deny their divinity. It confirms it, then strips it away. Yahweh alone survives the judgment. He alone remains eternal. The others fall. It is not monotheism by nature. It is monotheism by conquest. Other traces remain. In Genesis, when Elohim creates humanity, he speaks not in isolation, but in company. The text offers no clarification. Who is us?
Later interpretations suggest the divine court, or angelic hosts. But in the context of ancient Semitic religion, the answer is clearer and older. Elohim is not alone. He is part of a divine council, a plural presence speaking in unity. The shift to singular worship would come later, but the grammar remembers. Even the name El Shaddai, often translated as God Almighty, contains ambiguity. Shaddai may derive from a root meaning mountain, or breast, or destruction. No one knows for sure. But El Shaddai appears in Genesis, long before the name Yahweh is revealed. The patriarchs know him by this name. When Yahweh finally introduces himself to Moses, he says, "I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I was not known to them." The God of the ancestors had different names, different aspects, and perhaps different origins. These names were later merged, reconciled, made to point to the same being. But the text still holds their shadows. The Elohistic tradition, one of the four major sources scholars identify in the composition of the Pentateuch, uses the name Elohim almost exclusively until the revelation at Sinai. In this strand, God is distant, majestic, often appearing in dreams and through intermediaries. This contrasts with the Yahweh's tradition, where Yahweh walks in gardens and speaks face to face. The merging of these traditions during the exile did not eliminate the contradictions, it buried them under layers of redaction and theological polish, but in places the seams still show. Why retain the plural, then? Why not revise it to match the singular vision? The answer may lie in the very nature of transformation. Yahweh's rise to supremacy did not erase the past, it absorbed it. The plural name became a mark of totality, a God who embodied all divine functions: creator, judge, warrior, healer, king. In time, the old gods were not denied. They were reinterpreted as aspects of Elohim. Baal's storm was Yahweh's voice. El's wisdom became his own. The divine court became angels. The queen became metaphor. And the plural became singular in meaning, if not in form. In mystical traditions, the plural remains potent. Kabbalists see in Elohim the 10 Sephirot, the emanations through which the infinite divine manifests. They read the plural not as confusion, but as mystery, the infinite within the one, the many within the name. In Christian theology, the plural form became a seed for Trinitarian doctrine: Father, Son, and Spirit within a singular Godhead. The ambiguity of Elohim has served as a gateway into countless interpretations, because it was never meant to be clear. It was meant to be comprehensive. But underneath the interpretations, the historical core still burns. The name Elohim is a memory of a time when gods filled the sky, when altars stood in every village, when the divine was not a single voice, but a chorus, when Yahweh walked among others, not above them. The Bible tells us he won, but the language tells us how close it was.
The rain that swallowed the world did not fall once. It fell many times, across many myths, under many names, and the story we think we know of a righteous man, an ark, and the wrath of a god is not the beginning. It is the echo, a retelling, a sacred memory carried from older lands, where the rivers ran wide and the gods did not agree. Long before Noah built his vessel, another man stood on the banks of annihilation. His name was Utnapishtim, and his story is older than Genesis. Buried in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh holds within it a tale that feels eerily familiar, almost uncomfortably so. A divine warning, a wooden vessel, animals gathered 2 by 2, the great deluge sent by angry gods, and at the center of it all, a single man chosen to survive the unmaking of the world. The resemblance is not symbolic, it is not thematic, It is direct. So direct that it forces us to ask, where did the story begin? The Epic of Gilgamesh, etched in cuneiform on tablets more than 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible was finalized, presents a flood narrative that scholars have called one of the earliest great myths of human civilization. In it, the hero Gilgamesh seeks immortality and finds Utnapishtim, a man who was once mortal, but who survived the gods' flood and was granted eternal life. Utnapishtim recounts how the gods, enraged by human noise and corruption, decided to wipe out humanity. But one god, Ea, took pity. She whispered the secret to Utnapishtim through a wall, instructing him to build a massive boat and preserve life. The boat was cubical, sealed with pitch. Utnapishtim loaded it with animals, family, and craftsmen. When the storm came, it raged for 6 days and nights. The waters swallowed mountains. The gods, regretful and frightened by the chaos they had unleashed, huddled together in terror. When the storm ended, Utnapishtim sent out birds to find land, a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven that did not return. Sound familiar? The Genesis flood follows the same skeletal structure, but with crucial theological revisions. In the Bible, there is only one God, Yahweh, and his decision is not the result of quarrels among divine beings, but of a singular, moral judgment. Humanity has become wicked, the earth is filled with violence, and so Yahweh chooses Noah, a righteous man, and instructs him to build an ark. The materials, the measurements, the inclusion of animals, the release of birds, all mirror the older Mesopotamian story. But in Genesis, the chaos is not feared by God, it is controlled. The divine is no longer conflicted, it is sovereign. The similarities are not coincidental. The flood story in Genesis is a cultural adaptation, shaped and refined by Hebrew scribes, likely during or after the Babylonian exile. When the Jews were surrounded by Mesopotamian mythology, temples and scribal schools, the Gilgamesh tablets were known. Their themes were familiar. The exile provided both access and motivation to reshape those ancient tales into a distinctly Israelite framework. But the borrowing was not passive. It was strategic. The biblical version strips the story of divine conflict and polytheistic tension. The flood is not the result of squabbling gods or emotional outbursts. It is divine justice, deliberate, measured. The Hebrew scribes did not erase the flood motif. They purified it, placing it into a monotheistic lens that served the emerging theology of Yahweh's moral authority. Yet even in its revised form, the story retains traces of its mythic ancestry. The ark is sealed with pitch, a detail that ties it to Mesopotamian construction. The bird sequence is preserved almost identically. The mountains of Ararat echo the mountain peaks found in older flood narratives, and the cosmic implications of the flood, the idea that the divine has the power to reset the world, remain fully intact. What is more revealing, however, is the presence of multiple flood narratives within the Bible itself. In Genesis, scholars have long noted that 2 strands of the flood story, the priestly and the Yahwist, have been interwoven. In one version, Noah takes 2 of every animal. In another, 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 of the unclean. In one, the flood lasts 40 days. In the other, 150. The existence of these layers points to a deeper process, mythic synthesis. The redactors did not create from scratch. They compiled, revised, edited, and in doing so, they left behind seams, traces of an older plural world beneath the surface of monotheistic text. Outside the Bible, flood myths are ubiquitous. In India's ancient texts, Manu is warned of a flood by a fish and builds a boat. In Greek myth, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by Zeus. In Chinese legend, a great flood reshapes the earth under the reign of Yu the Great. These are not isolated stories.
They are archetypes, cultural memories of real catastrophes, perhaps the flooding of river valleys, the rise of sea levels after the Ice Age, encoded as divine punishment and cosmic cleansing. And in this vast sea of myth, the Genesis flood is both unique and inherited, sacred and borrowed. To recognize the influence of Gilgamesh on the Bible is not to diminish Scripture. It is to understand its context. The Bible is not a book written in a vacuum. It is a living document, crafted in dialogue with the ancient world, drawing from its stories, reshaping its symbols, and reorienting its meaning around a new vision of the divine. In this sense, the flood is not just a tale of destruction, it is a transition, a moment when myth becomes memory, and memory becomes theology, and yet, the flood continues to ripple through culture and consciousness. It appears in art, in liturgy, in warnings of modern apocalypse. It remains a symbol of both judgment and rebirth. But behind the familiar image of Noah and his ark, a deeper current flows, a current that reaches back to Utnapishtim, to ancient Sumer, to the clay tablets of long-forgotten scribes who first imagined that the gods could drown the world.
It stood alone, crackling in silence, lit but not consumed, a bush burning on the side of a forgotten mountain, and within it, a voice, no face, no image, just flame and command. The moment is iconic, embedded in the heart of the biblical mythos. It is here that Yahweh names himself. It is here that Moses, a fugitive and shepherd, becomes the vessel of liberation. But something in this scene lingers unnaturally, like smoke that refuses to fade. The burning bush is not just a miracle, it is a symbol, old and layered, its roots stretching far beyond Sinai. And if we peer beneath the surface, we may glimpse something even older, the fires of Egypt and the gods who once dwelt there. The desert burns differently than the forest. It is a quiet, still burning flame, one that does not rage, but smolders, glowing from within. This was the setting of Moses' encounter, and yet it is more than just setting. The image of fire that purifies but does not destroy is one that had long existed in Egyptian religious imagination. In their temples, in their tombs, in the heart of their rituals, fire was not merely an element. It was a divine force, a threshold between worlds, and Yahweh's self-revelation, hidden inside this unconsuming flame, may carry traces of these ancient rites. In Egyptian mythology, fire is both protective and transformative. The goddess, Sekhmet, lion-headed and fearsome, breathes fire that purges evil. The Eye of Ra, when angered, becomes a burning force, unleashed upon the world. Fire devours enemies, but it also clears the path for rebirth. The sun itself, the daily resurrection of Ra, is the ultimate fire, crossing the sky by day and descending into the underworld by night. There in the deepest hours, fire guides the soul through trials and judgment. Sacred fire was also central in temple practices. In ritual purification, priests would light incense and flame to banish impurity before approaching the gods. In funerary texts, the soul of the deceased was said to pass through a lake of fire, a trial that would either annihilate or transform. But one concept recurs again and again: fire that reveals truth, that strips away illusion, that prepares the soul to see the divine. And in this motif, we begin to understand the burning bush, not as anomaly, but as symbol. The bush, aflame but unburned, is the embodiment of paradox. Just as the divine is beyond comprehension, so is this fire, unnatural, impossible, and yet fully real. Yahweh chooses this moment, this image, to reveal his name, Ehiyah Asher, Ehiyah, I am that I am, or more literally, I will be what I will be. A phrase wrapped in mystery, shifting in time, refusing to be pinned down. It is not a name in the conventional sense.
It is presence, existence, force, and it emerges from fire, just as Egyptian gods often did. Moses, too, is not a figure of Israel alone. He is born in Egypt, raised in the house of Pharaoh, educated among the temples and priests. The man who sees the bush is already a hybrid, part Hebrew, part Egyptian, part Midianite. He flees to the desert after killing an Egyptian. He marries the daughter of a Midianite priest, and it is in that liminal space, neither Egypt nor Canaan, that the fire finds him. In Egyptian thought, deserts were places of divine encounter, of vision and death. The gods spoke in isolation, far from cities and temples, so it is no coincidence that Yahweh, the emerging deity of a marginal people, reveals himself not from a throne, but from a bush, burning alone in the sand. There is another Egyptian echo, one rarely spoken. The acacia tree, common in Sinai, was sacred in Egyptian lore. It was associated with the goddess Isis, sometimes called the grandmother of all gods. The tree of life in Heliopolitan theology, the acacia was said to house divine presence. Some versions of the myth even say the body of Osiris was enclosed in a tree that became a pillar, a container of sacred power. Could it be that the bush was not just any plant, but a symbol of life and death, a known image, in a new form? Even the voice that speaks from the fire does not introduce Yahweh as a universal God, not yet. He identifies himself through ancestral memory. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is still local, still tribal, but wrapped in cosmic fire. He is beginning to shift. He is beginning to absorb the signs of power once held by others. He is learning to speak like the gods of Egypt, in flame, in mystery, in impossible presence. The burning bush becomes the threshold through which Yahweh begins his transformation, from desert deity to liberator, from voice in the wilderness to shaper of empires, and what follows mirrors the rites of Egyptian priesthood. Moses resists, protests his inadequacy, asks for a sign. The staff becomes a serpent, another Egyptian symbol, tied to royalty and divine protection. His hand is made leprous and healed again, death and resurrection in a moment. These are initiations, not unlike those undergone by priests entering the inner chambers of the temple. Yahweh is not just commanding, he is initiating Moses into a new order. But unlike the gods of Egypt, Yahweh is veiled. He speaks, but he is unseen. He manifests in fire, but never shows his face. His presence is indirect, dangerous, hidden behind flame, cloud, and darkness. This is new and terrifying. The Egyptian gods had forms, statues, images, temples, but Yahweh is without image, without shape. He burns, but is not consumed. He speaks, but does not appear, and in that absence, he becomes absolute. It is this shift, from seen to unseen, from form to flame, that marks the birth of something radical, the transformation of divine presence from image to essence, from figure to fire. And it is through this fire that Yahweh will wage war against Egypt, against Pharaoh, against the very gods whose symbols he now reclaims and reconfigures. Each plague will echo an Egyptian domain. Water to blood, frogs, darkness, a slow unmaking of their cosmic order, and Moses, the man of the burning bush, will be the weapon, but the fire never truly leaves. It follows them, in the pillar that leads the Israelites through the desert, in the flame that descends on Sinai, in the fire that consumes offerings without smoke. Yahweh becomes known not by what he looks like, but by what he does: fire, thunder, voice, shaking earth. He is elemental, raw, a storm wrapped in holiness. The burning bush is thus more than a miracle. It is a cipher, a message encoded in symbol, one that whispers of Egypt, of ancient rites, of trees that hold the gods, of fire that speaks and transforms. It is Yahweh stepping onto the stage of world mythology, not as a stranger, but as a successor, one who takes the language of the divine and burns away its image, one who will not be named as others were, one who will speak from flames that do not die.
Saturn moves slowly. Its orbit is long, deliberate, ancient. Among the wandering stars known to the ancients, it is the last visible to the naked eye, the outer guardian of the known heavens. And throughout the esoteric traditions of antiquity, Saturn was never a benign figure. He was the judge, the limiter, the bringer of structure and endings. In Roman myth, he devoured his children. In astrology, he brings trials and discipline. In Kabbalistic lore, he governs the Sephirah of Bini, understanding, but also restriction. And for those who peer deeply into the oldest layers of religious symbolism, Saturn whispers a name hidden behind centuries of transformation: Yahweh. This association is not spoken in temples or sermons. It lives instead in shadows, in symbols, colors, and codes, and it begins not with a proclamation, but with a pattern, the pattern of black, of rest, of severity, of rules. Saturn, the planet of structure, is linked to the number 7. It rules Saturday, the Sabbath, the day set apart in biblical law as sacred. And the Sabbath is no gentle respite, it is command. You shall do no work. It is restriction, not merely rest, a cessation imposed by law, framed with warnings and enforced by divine authority. Violating it, in ancient times, brought death. This was not symbolic, it was legislated, and the God who issued this command was Yahweh. Saturn's number 7 echoes through the Bible: 7 days of creation, the 7th day is holy, 7 branches of the menorah, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 years of servitude, 7 cycles of 7. Time itself, under Yahweh's order, is structured around Saturnian rhythm. In this structure we see not only spiritual order, but cosmic imprint. Yahweh is not a god of wild ecstasy, like Dionysus. He is not the lover, like Eros. He is the architect, demanding, sovereign, exacting. He commands boundaries. He builds laws. He separates clean from unclean, holy from profane, Israel from the nations. These are not accidents. They are Saturnian fingerprints. The high priests of Yahweh, the Kohanim, were not robed in gold or blue alone. On the most sacred days, the garments were black or white. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day, the high priest entered the Holy of Holies dressed in linen, humble, pure, austere. But the priesthood also preserved a color of mourning, of gravity. Black, in esoteric symbolism, black is the color of Saturn, the planet associated with finality, death, and initiation. It is the color of robes worn by occult orders, judges, and ascetics. And in Kabbalah, Saturn is associated with the left pillar, the pillar of severity. Then there is the cube, simple, stark, geometrically perfect. The cube is a symbol of Saturn across countless esoteric systems. It represents structure, foundation, earth, and limitation. In Islamic tradition, the Kaaba, a black cube, is the holiest site. In Jewish mysticism, the tefillin worn during prayer are black cubes, bound by leather straps onto the forehead and arm. These cubes contain Torah verses, the law of Yahweh. The connection is unspoken, but profound. Saturn, the enforcer of boundaries, the planet of form, is represented through the sacred cube, and Yahweh is the God whose law is bound to the body. In ancient astrology, Saturn was malefic, the great teacher through hardship. He brought trials, isolation, barrenness, and Yahweh, in his oldest portrayals, mirrors this severity. He is the God of deserts, not gardens, the God of law, not laughter, the God who turns Lot's wife to salt, who strikes Uzzah, dead for touching the ark, who drowns the world, burns cities, tests the faithful with silence. He is righteous, yes, but also terrible, fearsome. His presence appears in fire, cloud, storm. He is not gentle,
He is immense, and like Saturn, he reveals truth through weight, not warmth. Even the earliest forms of the divine name reflect this duality. Yahweh, 4 letters, a tetragrammaton. In some traditions, these letters correspond to elements, to breath, to life, but in mystical readings, they form a cube, a name structured, exact, balanced. The hidden name, never to be spoken aloud, is treated with the same reverence that the ancients gave to planetary spirits. In Gnostic and Hermetic systems, Saturn is the gatekeeper, the boundary that separates the material world from the higher spheres, and Yahweh, too, is depicted as both the creator and the barrier. Access to him requires purity, ritual, obedience. The Holy of Holies is not open, it is hidden, forbidden, deadly to the unprepared. The association deepens when we examine ancient Gnostic texts. In some sects, Yahweh is not seen as the highest god, but as the demiurge, the blind craftsman, who builds the world in ignorance of the higher light. They called him Eeldaboth, the child of chaos, who claimed to be the only god. His flaw was not power, but pride. He mistook creation for sovereignty. And in this portrayal, he is linked not to love or grace, but to law, control, limitation. These are Saturn's traits, and though the Gnostics were heretical to Orthodox faith, they preserved a memory of cosmic hierarchy, one in which Yahweh ruled through structure, not through ultimate unity. Modern esoteric traditions have preserved this connection with quiet continuity. In ceremonial magic, Saturn governs the day of binding and discipline. In planetary Kabbalah, Saturn's influence governs the Sephira Bina, the womb of form, of order, of understanding, but also the place of grief, of distance, of judgment. And Yahweh's earliest roles, as judge, as giver of law, as force of consequence, mirror these attributes with chilling precision. Even the temple, the central place of Yahweh's presence, is Saturnian, in structure, measurements, purity codes, outer courts, inner sanctums. No spontaneity, no chaos, only ritual, rule boundaries. Saturn is the planet of architects, and Yahweh is the divine architect of cosmos, covenant, and consequence. The link between Yahweh and Saturn is not found in catechisms. It is not preached in synagogues or churches. It is buried beneath layers of doctrine, encoded in symbolism, whispered through mystical diagrams and planetary correspondences. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. The black cube, the seventh day, the law that weighs but also preserves, the presence that reveals itself through distance. These are Saturn's gifts, and Yahweh, especially in his earliest and most primal expressions, wears them like a mantle. In time, the image of Yahweh would soften, prophets would speak of mercy, psalmists would sing of love, the exiles would dream of return, of closeness, of redemption. But even in these, Saturn does not vanish. He watches from the edge of the sky, old, silent, immense. His rings turn slowly, his weight remains, and the God who spoke from fire, who carved law into stone, who ordered the cosmos by rhythm and rest, still bears the mark of the slowest star.
The light above all lights has no name. It is neither male nor female. It does not speak in thunder, nor demand burnt offerings. It is silent, still, beyond being, and yet this light, unknowable and pure, cast a reflection, and in that reflection something twisted formed, a being born, not of will, but of ignorance, a God who believed himself to be alone, a creator who thought he was the source. His name was not spoken in reverence among the Gnostics. His name was Yaldabaoth, the blind god, the arrogant one, and in his voice they heard echoes of Yahweh. The Gnosticism emerged in the first centuries of the Common Era, in the shadowlands between Judaism, Christianity, Platonic thought, and ancient Near Eastern mystery cults. It was never a single movement, but a constellation of secret teachings, a labyrinth of doctrines preserved in fragments, hidden in caves, whispered among initiates, and at its heart was a radical idea. The God of the Old Testament is not the ultimate God. He is a jailer, a usurper, a builder of worlds, but not of truth. And the universe he created, a prison of light, trapped in matter, according to the Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, particularly in writings like the Apocryphon of John, on the origin of the world, and the hypostasis of the archons. Creation began with a being called the monad, the invisible spirit, unknowable and absolute. From this infinite source emanated other divine beings, called aeons, pure aspects of light and thought. But one aeon, Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom, reached beyond her station, attempting to create without her consort. Her act of solitary creation, driven by a yearning to understand the depths, gave birth not to light, but to a flawed being, Yaldabaoth. He was monstrous, a lion-headed serpent, a being of immense power, but no awareness of the higher realms. Cast into a lower dimension, he surveyed the void, and mistaking it for emptiness, declared, "I am God, and there is no other." In his blindness, he created the material world, a cosmos of flawed symmetry and brutal beauty. He fashioned archons, rulers, to govern the spheres, and he built man in his image, echoing the divine patterns he dimly remembered. But he did not breathe life into man. That spark came from Sophia, who mourned her child, and secretly gifted her essence to humanity. Thus, according to the Gnostics, humans are divine souls trapped in flesh, divine sparks imprisoned by the jealous God, who believes he owns them. And this God, this false father, has many names. In some texts, he is called Sackless, the fool. In others, Samael, the blind god. But in nearly all, the structure of his creation, the laws, the wrath, the fear, mirrors the voice of Yahweh. In the Hebrew Bible, his demands for obedience, his anger at idols, his threats against those who challenge his will, these are not the traits of a loving creator. The Gnostics argue they are the marks of a cosmic tyrant. They point to the contradictions in Scripture: the God who walks in Eden, unaware of Adam's location; the God who regrets creating man; the God who demands Abraham kill his son, only to reverse the command at the last moment; the God who hardens Pharaoh's heart, just to display his own power. These, to the Gnostic mind, are not mysteries of divine will. They are signs of imperfection, of ego, of blindness. Yahweh is not evil in the human sense. He is incomplete, a creator who believes he is the beginning, unaware that he is merely a shadow. But the Gnostic vision does not end in despair, for into the world of flesh came a messenger, a revealer, not a savior who dies to appease divine wrath, but a bringer of gnosis, secret knowledge. This being, often identified with the figure of Christ, comes not to reconcile man with the demiurge, but to awaken the divine spark within. He is the emissary of the true God, the unknowable light, sent to remind souls of their origin beyond the stars, beyond the archons, beyond the prison of form. His death is not a sacrifice, but an act of defiance, a rupture in the false order, a shattering of illusion. The Gnostics read the Old Testament through new eyes. The serpent in Eden, not a deceiver but a liberator, a symbol of knowledge; the tree of life, a hidden gateway to freedom, denied by the jealous God; the flood, a purge of those who saw too much; the law, chains disguised as wisdom; then the voice that thundered from Sinai, not the voice of the ultimate, but of a being desperate to maintain control. In this inversion, Yahweh becomes not the culmination of divinity, but the barrier to it. Their cosmology was layered. Above Yaldabaoth were the aeons, arranged in syzygies, pairs of masculine and feminine principles. At the top, Barbelo, the mother of all, and beyond,
even her, the monad, source of all being, the true God, did not create through command, but through emanation. Creation was not fiat, but overflow. In this model, Yahweh is not the source, but a derivative, a demiurge, literally, a craftsman, capable of building, but not of originating. This view, dangerous and heretical, was condemned by early church fathers. Irenaeus, in his Against Heresies, attacks Gnostic beliefs as blasphemous distortions. Tertullian, Epiphanius, and Hippolytus followed suit, portraying the Gnostics as prideful and deluded, and yet, their writings survived, buried in jars, hidden in deserts, preserved in secrecy, and within those texts, Yahweh continues to burn, not as light, but as smoke. What makes the Gnostic vision so unnerving is its clarity. The Gnostic Yahweh is not a mystery. He is not paradoxical. He is the God of law, of punishment, of separation. He is Saturn. He is the architect. He is the builder of systems that demand obedience, but offer no transcendence. And the path beyond him is not through worship, but through awakening, through remembering what lies beyond the veil. Some Gnostic sects performed rituals of ascent, visualizations in which the soul, upon death, would pass through the 7 planetary spheres, confronting and bypassing the archons. At each level, passwords and signs were required. The soul had to prove it belonged to the higher light. Only then could it escape the orbit of the demiurge and return to the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. These are not myths of comfort, they are maps of escape. Even in modern esoteric traditions, the shadow of this idea lingers. The notion that the God of this world, of material form, of time, of limitation, is not the highest, that there is something beyond, and that the true spiritual journey is not submission, but liberation, the rejection of imposed authority, the unveiling of the self. To the Orthodox, this is heresy, blasphemy, the severing of covenant. But to the Gnostics, it was the deepest truth, that the world is a shell, and Yahweh is its jailer, that the law is a mirror, and only through gnosis, deep secret knowledge, can one shatter it, and that behind the false god, behind the roaring voice, and the tablets of stone, there waits something greater, something wordless, and it has never spoken in commandments, only in whispers of remember.
He came in fire and smoke. Mountains trembled, clouds blackened, the earth split beneath his presence, and the people, hearing his voice, begged not to hear it again. It was too much, too loud, too foreign, too powerful. Yahweh did not appear as a soft whisper in the heart. He descended with force, with spectacle, with terror, and for those who look past theology into the patterns of myth, scripture, and the stars, a different possibility begins to form, unsettling, seductive, and entirely outside the bounds of traditional belief. What if Yahweh was not only a god, but a visitor? What if the fiery descents, the technological artifacts, and the voice from the heavens were not metaphors, but literal? The ancient astronaut theory, first propelled into mainstream consciousness by thinkers like Erich von Däniken in his 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, suggests that many myths of divine beings may in fact record encounters with advanced extraterrestrial intelligences. The theory is not theology, it is alternative archaeology, a speculative synthesis of ancient texts, unexplained artifacts, and recurring motifs, most notably beings who descend from the sky in clouds, light, or chariots, bringing knowledge, laws, and power. And among these, Yahweh's appearances stand out with uncanny resonance. Consider the scene at Mount Sinai. The mountain shakes violently, thunder roars, a thick cloud descends, fire engulfs the peak, a trumpet-like sound grows louder and louder, and then the voice, a voice that terrifies an entire nation into submission. The text in Exodus 19 describes this moment with apocalyptic grandeur, but filtered through ancient eyes. Today one might call it a vertical landing, a craft descending in a cloud of smoke, flames, sound and vibration. The ground shudders, the people stand back, and a communication begins. In Exodus 24:17, Yahweh's presence is described as a devouring fire on the top of the mountain. In Deuteronomy 4:36, it says, "Out of heaven, he let you hear his voice, that he might instruct you, and upon earth, he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire." These are not theophanies of gentleness. They are raw, violent, and physical. Ancient people interpreted them as divine, but today with new frames of reference, fire, thunder, smoke, structured voices, one might describe them differently. The Ark of the Covenant itself becomes a central artifact in this theory, a technological anomaly, described with meticulous detail, a gold-covered wooden chest, with specific dimensions, carried with poles, containing power so immense that touching it brought instant death. In 2 Samuel 6:6-7, Uzzah dies simply by laying a hand on it to steady it. Some speculate the ark emitted radiation, others believe it was a power source or communication device. It was carried into battle, and when present, Israel triumphed. When stolen or mishandled, devastation followed. It emitted voices. It caused fear. It had to be stored in a sacred chamber, behind multiple layers of separation. Even the description of the cherubim atop the ark, winged, facing each other, forming a mercy seat, where Yahweh would speak, echoes not only religious iconography, but something functional, as though it were a control panel, a device for contact. Yahweh spoke from between the cherubim, not above the heavens, but between golden constructs atop a portable chest. The ark was kept in the tabernacle, itself a mobile structure of precise measurements, oriented directionally, surrounded by a system of rituals that mirror containment protocols. In Ezekiel 1, the prophet experiences one of the most enigmatic visions in all of Scripture. He sees wheels within wheels, creatures of lightning, and a glowing throne descending from the sky. The being seated on the throne is described in metallic and fire-like imagery. The living creatures move in unison, not turning as they move. Their wings produce a sound like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty. Scholars have wrestled with this passage for centuries. Some call it a spiritual vision. Others, especially proponents of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, see it as a machine, a craft, a landing. The wheels, rotating in impossible directions, resemble modern depictions of gyroscopic flight systems. The creatures, described in part as metallic and radiant, could be drones or suits. The throne, carried by these wheels and creatures, radiates fire and brilliance. The being upon it, Yahweh, appears in human form, but surrounded by a field of glowing light. This is not a distant abstraction. This is a manifestation, physical and overwhelming. In other texts, Yahweh travels in clouds, in chariots of fire, in whirlwinds. The pillar of cloud by day, and fire by night, that led Israel through the wilderness, is often interpreted by ancient astronaut theorists as a mobile guidance system, a constant presence, moving ahead, stopping, speaking, burning. In Numbers 9, the cloud settles over the tabernacle, and when it lifts, the Israelites break camp. The narrative is one of coordination, almost like a military convoy, awaiting commands. The Gnostic reinterpretations of Yahweh as the demiurge overlap with this vision. If Yahweh is not the ultimate being, but a powerful entity within a structured hierarchy, it leaves room for speculation. Could he have been a physical intelligence, a being among many, masquerading as supreme? In some Gnostic myths, the archons, the rulers under the demiurge, are described as makers of the body, architects of flesh. Their purpose is to keep humanity ignorant of the higher realms. Could this align with a technological species, terraforming, guiding,
or even engineering humanity. Further tantalizing are the comparisons between ancient Mesopotamian gods and astronaut-like figures. Deities like Enki, Anu, and Marduk descend from the heavens, bring laws, establish cities. The Sumerians speak of the Anunnaki, those who came from the stars. These beings bring tools, symbols, knowledge. They walk with kings. Some speculate that Yahweh is an evolution of one of these figures, perhaps even Marduk, whose iconography and attributes he later absorbs. That the most compelling argument may not lie in isolated verses or speculative translations. It lies in the pattern, the recurring theme of a being who descends, who commands with terrifying precision, who builds nations, alters landscapes, and demands absolute loyalty. Yahweh's wrath, his insistence on exclusive worship, his destruction of rivals, his manipulation of weather, disease, and fertility. These are not merely spiritual traits. They are the marks of a being with power over the environment, biological systems, and social engineering. The Israelites were unlike their neighbors in one crucial way. They claimed to have a God who walked among them, not through idols, but through direct encounter, not once, but repeatedly. Their stories speak of voices from the sky, tablets written by divine fire, mountains quaking under invisible presence, and perhaps they recorded what they saw as best they could, filtered through the language of the time, encoded in religious terminology, preserved in reverence and fear. The ancient astronaut theory does not dismiss faith. It proposes that what ancient peoples called gods may have been something else, beings advanced enough to appear divine, whose motives remain hidden, whose origins are not of earth. In this view, Yahweh becomes not less significant, but more mysterious. Was he one of many, a leader among visitors, a guardian, a conqueror, a guide? The texts offer hints, but no certainty. What is certain is this: Yahweh, as described in the earliest accounts, is not abstract. He is active, manifest, territorial, consuming, and very real. Whether as God demiurge or visitor, his presence is overwhelming. He leaves marks on stone, on law, on memory. And for those willing to look beyond doctrine, into fire, smoke, thunder, and command, a new vision emerges, one in which the divine may not come from above in metaphor, but from above in truth, from stars, from craft, from light.
Light and darkness, creator and adversary, father and accuser. For centuries, theology has drawn a thick dividing line between Yahweh, the supreme God of order, law, and righteousness, and Satan, the rebellious spirit, the deceiver, the fallen one. But when the ancient texts are read without modern lenses, and the veil of moral dualism is lifted, something strange begins to emerge. The voice that blesses is also the voice that curses. The one who creates is also the one who destroys. The fire from heaven that consumes offerings also consumes cities. And slowly, an idea begins to whisper from the shadows of forgotten scripture and mystic speculation. Yahweh and Satan may not be enemies, but reflections, two sides of the same cosmic force. The Bible never describes Satan with the clarity that tradition later attributes to him. The serpent in Eden is never named. The accuser in Job is called Ha-Satan, the adversary, a title, not a name. In Zechariah, Satan stands before Yahweh as a kind of prosecuting attorney. He is not yet the devil, not the horned icon of medieval fear, but a function within the divine court. He opposes, he tests, but he does so with permission. Yahweh and Satan are not rivals, they are collaborators. Take the story of Job. It begins with Satan appearing in the heavenly court, not cast out, but welcomed. Yahweh asks him where he's been. Satan replies, walking to and fro upon the earth. What follows is not a battle, but a wager. Yahweh allows Satan to test Job, not against his will, but by granting him the power to inflict suffering. It is Yahweh who sets the terms, Yahweh who withdraws protection, Yahweh who reasserts control when it suits him. In this unsettling exchange, the roles blur. Is Satan the adversary, or simply an instrument of divine will? In Isaiah 45:7, Yahweh declares something few dare to emphasize. I form the light, and create darkness. I make peace, and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. The Hebrew word used here for evil is re, which means calamity, distress, badness, the same word used for moral evil elsewhere. Yahweh, by his own voice, claims authorship of both the good and the terrifying. He is not the God of light alone, he is the totality. The Hebrew Bible is filled with examples of Yahweh's fury. He floods the earth, obliterates Sodom, sends plagues upon Egypt, orders genocides in Canaan, and threatens his own people with disease, exile and starvation if they disobey. His commandments are absolute, his punishments severe. His jealousy is not metaphor, it is named directly. In Exodus 34:14, we read, For thou shalt worship no other God, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, not just a God who experiences jealousy, but jealous is his name. And then there is the serpent. In the garden, it is not Satan who tempts Eve, at least, not explicitly. It is a serpent, a creature described as wise. The serpent promises knowledge, not death. He says you will not die, but your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God. And what happens? Eve eats. She does not die. Her eyes are opened. Yahweh descends in anger, not because the serpent lied, but because he told an uncomfortable truth. The punishment follows not from deception, but from disobedience. And what was the crime? Seeking knowledge. Throughout occult and Gnostic systems, the serpent is often recast, not as the enemy, but as the liberator, the bringer of gnosis. And Yahweh, the enforcer of boundaries, becomes the one who would keep humanity in ignorance, not out of hatred, but out of control. In this inversion, Satan is not the adversary of the human spirit, but its awakener. And Yahweh, far from being the loving father, becomes the warden. Mystics and esoteric thinkers across centuries have felt the tension. The 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated for his view that God was not a person, but nature itself, both creative and destructive. The Kabbalists, too, wrestled with the duality of divine expression. In the Tree of Life, Yahweh corresponds to several spheres, not just chesed kindness, but also Gevurah judgment, severity. The left-hand path of the tree is the path of restriction, fire, punishment, all within the divine system. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the divine light fractures, and evil emerges from within the divine, not outside of it. Even the names themselves begin to blur. Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, is associated with mercy, but Elohim, another name for God, used frequently in Genesis, is the name used in the context of judgment and law. And it is Elohim who speaks in Genesis 1, the version of creation where God is distant, authoritative, commanding, not intimate. Many scholars believe Elohim was once a distinct deity, later merged into Yahweh's identity. Could the very process of monotheization have folded multiple personalities into one, creating a divine figure who contains contradictions because he was once many? In the apocryphal text, 1 Enoch, we find a vision of rebellious angels, the Watchers, who descend to earth, mate with humans, and teach forbidden knowledge. Their leader is Azazel, a figure who later becomes conflated with Satan. But in some traditions, Azazel is not condemned for evil, but for giving mankind tools, metallurgy, cosmetics, herbs, the seeds of civilization. Yahweh's wrath is swift, the Watchers are bound, the world is flooded, knowledge is suppressed. Once again, the bringers of enlightenment are punished, while the enforcer remains enthroned. Could it be that Satan and Yahweh are not enemies, but masks? One face turned toward order, the other toward rebellion. One hand gives law, the other tests its limits. The dialectic of cosmos, the creator and the destroyer, bound in one name. In Hinduism, this duality is not hidden. Shiva destroys,
but also liberates. In ancient Egypt, Set is both protector and murderer. The ancients did not need their gods to be morally perfect. They needed them to be complete. In the book of Revelation, Satan is cast down, but by the same divine will that allows the apocalypse. Yahweh sends plagues again, commands angels to burn the earth, opens the pit, unleashes horsemen, and in the end, installs a new order, with his own name marked on the foreheads of the saved. The book is often read as a tale of triumph, but it is also a tale of dominion, of absolute control, of judgment without appeal. The same patterns, fire, fear, finality, emerge once more. Modern occultists, like Aleister Crowley, explored these dualities in new language. He wrote of the Aeon of Horus, the age of the child, in which the old gods of obedience must fall. For Crowley, the divine spark was to be claimed, not worshipped, and the fear of Yahweh was to be replaced by the courage of will. His motto, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," was not hedonism, but revolt against servitude. In such systems, Satan is not a devil, but a symbol of personal sovereignty, and Yahweh, though acknowledged as powerful, becomes the symbol of external control. The question then is not, is Yahweh Satan, but rather, is the distinction even real? Are we not witnessing, across these texts and traditions, a single force, ancient, multifaceted, incomprehensible, that births and destroys, builds and judges, liberates and binds? Perhaps the true heresy is not to question God, but to imagine he is simple, that he is only love, only wrath, only one side of the cosmic mirror. In the book of Isaiah, Yahweh declares, "There is none beside me," and perhaps that is the final key. If he is all, then he is also his own opposite, creator and destroyer, order and chaos, father and adversary, the light that casts the longest shadow. And the name we call Satan may be not his enemy, but his reflection, his servant, his test, or even his hidden self.
Long before he was proclaimed the One, the Almighty, the I Am, that I am, Yahweh whispered from the wilderness. He was a voice in the wind, a force in the storm, a name spoken in the hush of tribal tents beneath starless skies. He did not rule the heavens, he haunted the deserts, a god not of empire, but of edges. His presence flickered across the rock-strewn trails of nomads, his fury unleashed not in temples, but in tempests. There was no crown on his head, no throne among the stars, only the fire, the smoke, and the echo of something ancient, restless, and waiting to be shaped. The journey from this early raw spirit form to the supreme, omnipotent creator is not a straight line. It is a winding ascent, marked by war, exile, revelation, and the relentless hunger of mankind to make sense of the divine. Yahweh did not begin as the only God, he became it. In the earliest texts, preserved in fragments of Canaanite poetry and echoed in Israelite psalms, we glimpse a Yahweh who does not claim exclusivity. He moves among other gods, he competes, he shares the heavens. In Deuteronomy 32:8-9, the ancient reading tells us that the Most High divided up the nations according to the number of the sons of God, and Yahweh's portion was Israel. This suggests a divine council, a pantheon, in which Yahweh was assigned a specific people, not unlike the gods of neighboring Mesopotamia, Canaan, or Egypt, each of whom ruled over their own territories, clans, and rituals. The Ugaritic texts, discovered at Ras Shamra in the early 20th century, confirmed that the ancient Near East was a religious mosaic. There was El, the High Father God, Bala Storm Wielder, Asherah, the Mother Goddess, Mort, the Devourer of Life. In this crowded divine world, Yahweh was one voice among many, yet something strange began to happen. Around the 9th century BCE, the tribal god of the Israelites, once invoked alongside others, began to absorb their attributes. El's title, Elyon, the Most High, was used for Yahweh, Bala's control of storms and fertility became Yahweh's domain. Asherah, once possibly his consort, disappeared from sanctioned worship. A process had begun, not of denial, but of consolidation. Yahweh did not merely vanquish other gods, he consumed them. This transformation mirrored political change. As Israel coalesced from scattered tribes into a monarchy, so too did its theology shift from fluidity to focus. Under kings like Hezekiah, and especially Josiah, religious reform became central to national identity. Shrines were torn down, priests centralized worship in Jerusalem, texts were rewritten to reinforce singular devotion. The multiplicity of early Yahwism was suppressed, but not erased. In the substratum of Scripture, traces remain. Psalm 82 speaks of God standing in the divine assembly, judging among gods. The first commandment is not, "There are no other gods," but "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE was a spiritual earthquake. The temple, the dwelling place of Yahweh's presence, was destroyed. The people scattered, and yet, in this devastation, a new theology crystallized. Yahweh was no longer just the God of Israel, he became the God of all creation. In exile, the prophets spoke not only of restoration, but of universality. Isaiah 45:5 declares, "I am the Lord, and there is none else." The trauma of conquest transformed into theological expansion. Yahweh was no longer a territorial deity, he transcended geography, temple, tribe. The heavens were now his domain, the earth his footstool. What began as survival became supremacy. The editors and scribes of the exilic and post-exilic period undertook a monumental task to reshape the divine narrative. Texts were compiled, merged, redacted. The multiple voices of tradition, the Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources, were woven into a single, if contradictory, scripture. Within its pages, Yahweh's identity was solidified. He created the world with a word. He chose Abraham. He guided Moses. He revealed the law. He punished, rewarded, and redeemed. No longer a spirit of the desert, Yahweh became history's architect. Yet even here, the evolution did not end. The post-biblical period saw Yahweh's nature undergo further metamorphosis through the lenses of philosophy and mysticism. Hellenistic influence introduced new concepts: omniscience, omnipresence, immutability. The Greek idea of the one pure and absolute began to fuse with Hebrew monotheism. Yahweh was no longer just a being, he became being itself. The rabbis of the Talmud wrestled with his paradoxes. Medieval Jewish thinkers like Maimonides sought to strip him of all anthropomorphism, presenting him as pure intellect. Meanwhile, mystics in Kabbalistic circles layered new interpretations. Yahweh as Ein Sof, the infinite, unknowable source, beyond form, beyond name. Each stage of this transformation reflects more than theology. It reveals the psychology of civilization. As society grew in complexity, so too did its God. From tribal protector to cosmic judge, from warrior storm deity to metaphysical unity, Yahweh's journey mirrors humanity's. From survival in harsh wilderness to the construction of temples, laws, empires, and ultimately, self-reflection, his image grew as humanity's needs changed. Each generation sculpting the divine face they needed to see. Even within Christianity and Islam, Yahweh is reborn again. As God the Father, he gains a new role within the Trinity, distinct yet consubstantial. As Allah, his image is refined into absolute unity, shorn of all partners, idols, and anthropomorphic limits. The divine name is shielded, revered, and abstracted, and yet, in all these forms, echoes of the ancient desert God remain. The jealousy, the fire, the voice that breaks mountains, the command to obey. Theologians debate whether this evolution was revelation or invention. Was Yahweh always supreme, merely revealing himself in stages, or was he raised, gradually, by human hands, exalted through myth,
preserved in ritual, and expanded through text until nothing else remained. Either answer leads to the same place. Yahweh became more than a god. He became a symbol of totality. But something was lost in the ascent. The intimacy of the Spirit who walked in gardens, who argued with Abraham, who wrestled Jacob in the night, gave way to abstraction. The roaring storm was replaced by doctrine. The personal became philosophical. And yet, the mystery lingers. The Tetragrammaton, Yahweh GGH, is still unspoken, still hidden, still vibrating with unknown meaning. Some say it mimics breath itself. Inhale, Yahweh, exhale, way. A God not just in the sky, but within the act of being. Not a name to speak, but an experience to embody. Yahweh's evolution is not just theological, it is existential. It is the story of how humans process the unknown, how we name the forces that shape us, how we organize awe. No other deity in human history has undergone such a radical transformation, nor retained so many of the scars of its past. From storm to silence, from fire to formula, Yahweh is both the shadow of ancient fears and the mirror of modern faith.
You've followed the fire and the smoke. You've descended into caves of forgotten scripture, crossed the sands where gods once walked among mortals, and gazed into the storm clouds of ancient memory. Now, you stand before the question that echoes through centuries, temples, wars, and whispers in the dark. Who is Yahweh to you? Not to the priest, the scribe, or the scholar, but to you, because behind all the symbols, rituals, doctrines, and names, what remains is the unknown. And it is there, in the silence behind the veil, that truth waits. We have seen Yahweh the storm god, thundering on mountain tops, descending in fire and trembling earth, wielding power over nature and fear. We have glimpsed him in the texts of Moabite kings and Egyptian records, not yet almighty, but localized, one name among many. We have watched him rise from a tribal deity to a cosmic architect, consuming other gods, reworking myths, redefining loyalty through command. And we have tracked his footprints into exile, where pain gave birth to monotheism, and memory was rewritten in divine ink. He was once called jealous. He burned cities to ash. He struck down the curious and the defiant. He demanded exclusivity, not always because he was alone, but perhaps because he wasn't. The forbidden texts tell us this story was never just about belief. It was about control, survival, narrative dominance. He was not just a god. He was the sword of a people, the voice of a priesthood, the silence of a mystery too vast to name. But then something shifted. In Babylon, Yahweh learned to transcend temples. In Persia, he became the ultimate authority. In Greece, he was filtered through philosophy. In Rome, he became Father. In Arabia, he returned with fire. Each transformation brought him closer to the unreachable, but also further from the windswept hills where he once thundered, face to face with trembling mortals. And yet, the relics remain. The ancient pronunciation of his name was lost, or hidden. The Tetragrammaton, YHWH, is not a word but a cipher. Some mystics say it imitates the sound of breath. Yah inhale, Way exhale. That to live is to speak his name, that he is not distant, but within. Others say his name must never be spoken because it is a trigger, a code for a force too powerful, too ancient, too real. Some believe the original name carried vibration, sound magic encoded in sacred letters, lost with the destruction of the temple, retained only by secret schools whose bloodlines vanish into the folds of history. There are those who believe Yahweh was never a god in the human sense, but a presence, an intelligence, a guardian species that shaped early humanity, cloaked in metaphor and fear.
The ancient astronaut theorists speak of the fire that descends, the cloud that hovers, the arc that hums with deadly force. In this lens, Yahweh becomes a shadow of something technological, a name assigned to a visitor, misunderstood by those without the words to describe him. Not divine perhaps, but something else. And still others go deeper, into Gnosticism, where Yahweh is no longer a God of love, but the demiurge, a jailer of souls, who binds light in flesh and demands worship not to liberate, but to rule. In this vision, the God of Eden is the same one who feared the humans would eat from the tree of life and become as gods themselves. It is a chilling inversion, yet one rooted in ancient texts, hidden for centuries in caves, in codices, in heresies, whispered by those burned for asking the wrong questions. And then, there is the tradition that sees Yahweh as the true and only God, whose revelations were not gradual evolution, but carefully timed disclosures to a growing species, that the destruction, the laws, the fire, were not cruelty, but training, divine discipline for a rebellious humanity, that he is both mercy and judgment, both distant and near, that he is love through order, that he is one. But even this image splits again. Some rabbis say Yahweh is not a being, but being, the source of all that is, was and will be, that the stories are masks, accommodations to human limitation, that the voice in the whirlwind was never a person, but a pattern, the architecture behind atoms, the will within chaos, the center that holds. This Yahweh is not above, but within, not a figure on a throne, but the flame that consumes and does not destroy. Yet something resists finality. He is not a God who leaves us with easy answers. He confounds categories. He orders genocide and offers comfort. He hides and reveals. He dwells in a box, then fills the heavens. He writes on stone, then vanishes into silence. He speaks in riddles. He demands obedience, yet calls for love. He is both father and force, storm and silence, jealous and just. No image contains him. No system fully explains him. In the Zohar, the great Kabbalistic text, the highest aspect of God is called Ein Sof, the endless, the infinite. No attributes, no name, and Yahweh is a name within that, a mask lowered for human contact. But what lies behind the mask? Is it compassion, fire, emptiness, a mind, a law, a love beyond comprehension, or a force that simply is, shaping worlds with indifference and awe? The architecture of temples, the formulas of alchemists, the geometry of sacred texts, all speak of a God that is not just worshipped, but studied, encrypted, feared. Yahweh has been the inspiration of empires and the excuse for atrocities. His name has been written in gold and in blood, in code and in curse, in whispers and in screams. And still he remains, elusive, controversial, alive in the minds of billions. So now, after all this, the archaeology, the forbidden scriptures, the astrological alignments, the mystic geometries, the blood-soaked pages, and the light-filled visions, the story returns to you, not with answers, but with reflection. Is Yahweh the Eternal One, source of all, beyond all names? Is he the God of Israel, exalted above others through conquest and myth? Is he the architect of law and fire, judge of nations, voice of justice? Or is he a mask for something older, a spirit from the deserts, a visitor from the stars, a remnant of polytheism, reshaped by power? Or perhaps he is all of these and none. The mystery is not in the facts, it is in the paradox. And it is this paradox that keeps Yahweh alive, not just in texts, but in minds that dare to look beyond what they're told. For every seeker, the path winds differently. Some bow, some walk away, some gaze into the fire and feel something look back. So tell me, Who is Yahweh to you? Let the question linger. Let it disturb. Let it inspire. And when you're ready, share your thoughts in the comments. This is the Dark Storyteller, and the journey is far from over. Don't forget to subscribe. More hidden truths await.